They locked her in the attic because frightened girls are easier to control when no one can hear them scream. The first bell rang at 6:12 in the morning. Eveline Marrow counted it through the ceiling beams above her head. One sharp chime that cut through the cold attic air like a blade against glass. Then another. Then another. By the fourth bell, she had already pulled the thin gray blanket tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the November cold leaking through the cracked roof slates. By the sixth bell, she knew her mother was angry. Vivian Marrow never rang twice unless she intended punishment. Eveline sat motionless on the narrow bed pushed beneath the slanted attic ceiling and stared at the frost gathered along the tiny circular window across the room. The ice looked delicate from a distance, beautiful even, but she knew better. Everything beautiful in this house cut eventually. The seventh bell came harder than the others. Longer, demanding. Eveline closed her eyes for a moment. Her cheek still hurt from yesterday. Not badly. Vivian never struck where bruises could be easily seen by guests. That would have been careless. Instead, she preferred wrists, shoulders, ribs beneath corsets, places hidden beneath silk and lace and proper posture. Places society never looked. Downstairs, footsteps moved quickly across the marble halls. Servants. Nervous ones. She could always tell the difference. Calm servants walked evenly. Nervous servants hurried without meaning to. Something unusual was happening. Eveline rose slowly from the bed. The attic room was barely 12 feet wide, cold enough that her breath lingered pale in the air. Her mother called it a retreat for delicate nerves. The servants called it the north attic when Vivian was not listening. Eveline called it what it was. A cage with wallpaper. A small iron basin sat beside the mirror. The water inside had nearly frozen overnight. She dipped trembling fingers into it anyway and pressed the cold against her swollen lip. The sting forced her fully awake. Her reflection stared back from the cracked mirror above the washstand. 20 years old. Pale skin. Hair the color of faded wheat hanging loose down her shoulders because she had not been permitted a maid in over a year. Her gray eyes looked larger lately, hollowed out by too many sleepless nights and too many careful silences. There was a bruise fading beneath her jawline. Yellow at the edges now. Easier to hide. Vivian would approve of that. Another bell rang downstairs. Longer this time. Eveline inhaled slowly. Count to 5. Always count before moving. That was how she survived this house. Panic made noise. Noise brought punishment. A knock came suddenly at the attic door. 3 quick taps. Then silence. Miss Eveline. The voice was soft and strained. Mrs. Porter. The housekeeper. Eveline crossed the room and opened the door carefully. Mrs. Porter stood outside wrapped in a dark wool shawl despite the warmth downstairs. The older woman's face had gone pale beneath the candlelight. Your mother wants you in the west drawing room immediately, she whispered. Eveline frowned faintly. The west room. Visitors were only received there for important business. Marriage negotiations. Political dinners. Wealthy guests. Vivian reserved that room for people she intended to impress or manipulate. Usually both. Mrs. Porter glanced nervously down the staircase before leaning closer. There is a carriage outside. Eveline said nothing. Black horses, the housekeeper continued quietly. 4 of them. And soldiers. Something cold slipped down Eveline's spine. Whose carriage? Mrs. Porter swallowed. Nobody told us. But Mr. Hargrove nearly dropped the silver tray when he saw the crest. Eveline felt her stomach tighten. What crest? The older woman lowered her voice further. Ashbourne. Silence swallowed the attic hallway. Even the distant bells downstairs seemed to disappear for a moment. Eveline stared at her. Duke Lucian Ashbourne. The name alone carried weight heavy enough to silence entire rooms. Children in London used to frighten each other with stories about him. Nobles spoke carefully when discussing the Duke of Northmoor. Merchants lowered prices the moment his seal appeared on contracts. Soldiers who fought beside him during the border wars described him the same way every time. Quiet. That was always the word. Quiet and dangerous. They said he had once stared down an armed rebellion without raising his voice. They said he buried enemies faster than winter buried villages in the north. They said his own brother died under mysterious circumstances 15 years ago, and nobody dared ask questions afterward. Eveline had never seen him before. Men like Lucian Ashbourne did not visit houses like Marrow Estate without reason. "Why is he here?" she asked softly. Mrs. Porter looked at her with something dangerously close to pity. "Your mother has been smiling all morning." Eveline's throat tightened. That frightened her more than the Duke did. Vivian smiling meant plans, calculations, cruelty wrapped in elegance. "Miss Eveline," the housekeeper whispered carefully, "whatever happens downstairs, do not let her provoke you today." Eveline almost laughed at that. A tired sound caught somewhere behind her ribs but never escaped her mouth. Vivian did not need provoking. She only needed opportunity. "I understand," she said quietly. Mrs. Porter hesitated. "There is something else." Eveline looked up. The Duke arrived alone. That made even less sense. Men like Lucian Ashbourne traveled with advisors, guards, secretaries, entire walls of protection built around power. "Are you certain?" "Yes." The housekeeper glanced downward again. "And Miss Eveline?" "Yes." "He did not remove his gloves when your mother greeted him." Eveline frowned slightly. "Why does that matter?" Mrs. Porter looked suddenly uncomfortable. "Because he has been standing in that drawing room for 20 minutes and he has not sat down once." A strange unease settled beneath Eveline's ribs. Not fear exactly. Something sharper. Anticipation. Downstairs, another bell rang. This time Vivian herself called upward from below. "Eveline." Her mother's voice floated through the stairwell smooth as silk and twice as suffocating. "Do not embarrass me today." Eveline closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The warning hidden beneath elegance. She opened them again and turned back toward the mirror. Mrs. Porter stepped quietly away while Eveline reached for the plain gray dress hanging beside the bed. The fabric was old and stiff from repeated washing. Vivian preferred her daughter in colorless things lately. Easier to appear fragile that way. Easier to appear unstable. Eveline dressed slowly, fastening each button with careful fingers. Her hands no longer shook after years of practice. Fear had become routine inside this house. That was the truly terrible thing about cruelty. Eventually it became furniture. She brushed her hair back and pinned it loosely at the nape of her neck. No jewelry. No perfume. Vivian had taken most of those months ago, after claiming Eveline no longer needed distractions while recovering from her episodes. Episodes. Such a pretty word for imprisonment. The attic door remained open behind her. For one reckless second, Eveline considered running. Not downstairs. Away. Through the servants' staircase. Out the back gate. Into the woods beyond the frozen lake. She imagined the cold air burning inside her lungs while she ran until Marrow Estate disappeared behind her forever. Then reality returned quietly. Women without money disappeared faster than snow beneath carriage wheels. Especially frightened women. Especially alone ones. So instead she straightened her shoulders and walked toward the staircase. The mansion below looked beautiful the way mausoleums looked beautiful. Marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Oil paintings lined the walls in expensive gold frames. Every clock ticked in perfect rhythm because Vivian demanded perfection from everything except herself. Eveline descended carefully, one hand gliding along the polished banister. Voices drifted faintly from the west drawing room at the end of the hall. Her mother's bright social laughter echoed first. Then silence. No second voice answered. The silence unsettled her more than conversation would have. When she reached the final stair, Mr. Hargrove the butler appeared suddenly beside her. The older man usually carried himself with military precision. This morning he looked rattled. "Miss Marrow," he said quickly, "your mother is waiting." Eveline nodded once. "Is the Duke still here?" The butler hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Yes." "Has he said anything?" Another pause. "Very little, of course." Eveline turned toward the drawing room. The closer she moved toward the doors, the colder the house seemed to become. By the time she reached the entrance, her heartbeat had become loud enough to feel in her throat. The double doors stood partially open. Warm firelight spilled across the marble floor. Vivian sat elegantly upon the velvet sofa wearing dark emerald silk and pearls at her throat. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. Perfect monster. And near the far window stood Duke Lucian Ashbourne. He did not turn when Eveline entered. He stood with one gloved hand behind his back staring through the frost-coated glass toward the dead winter gardens outside. Tall enough to make the room itself seem smaller. Broad shoulders beneath a black wool coat. Dark hair touched faintly with silver near the temples. Stillness wrapped around him like another layer of clothing. Not relaxed stillness. Controlled stillness. The kind men learned after surviving terrible things. The fire cracked softly behind him. He did not move. Vivian's smile widened the moment she saw Eveline. "There you are, darling." Eveline stopped just inside the doorway. "Mother, come closer." She obeyed automatically. Years of conditioning moved her before thought could interfere. Lucian Ashbourne finally turned then. Slowly. His pale gray eyes landed on her face with unsettling calm. Not admiration. Not pity. Observation. He looked at her the way experienced generals studied battlefields. Quietly. Thoroughly. Nothing in his expression changed. But something inside Eveline suddenly tightened anyway. Because for the first time in years, someone was actually looking at her. Not through her. Not around her. Her. Lucian's gaze drifted downward briefly. To the fading bruise near her jaw. Then to her hands clasped tightly together before her waist. Then back to her eyes. Silence stretched across the room. Vivian laughed lightly to break it. "My daughter has always been painfully shy." Lucian Ashbourne did not look away from Eveline when he spoke. No, his voice was low, roughened slightly by age and winter. "That is not what frightened looks like." The room went so quiet that Eveline could hear the fire settling inside the marble hearth. A soft crack. A hiss of burning cedar. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Vivian Marrow recovered first. She always did. "Your Grace," she said smoothly, setting down her teacup with elegant precision. "I assure you my daughter has always been overly sensitive. Her health has been delicate since childhood." Lucian Ashbourne continued looking directly at Eveline. "Sensitive people do not flinch before anyone speaks." Vivian's smile tightened almost invisibly. Eveline felt her pulse stumble beneath her ribs. Nobody contradicted her mother. Not openly. Not in this house. Certainly not a duke whose very silence seemed capable of swallowing entire rooms whole. Vivian rose gracefully from the sofa and crossed the room toward Eveline. The faint scent of rose perfume followed her like poison wrapped in flowers. She reached for Eveline's arm with gentle fingers. Too gentle. Always too gentle when witnesses were present. "My daughter has suffered unfortunate emotional episodes since her father's passing," Vivian explained softly. "Grief affects young women differently." Lucian's gaze dropped briefly to Vivian's hand resting around Eveline's wrist. Eveline saw it happen. A small thing. Barely visible. But the Duke's expression changed by the smallest fraction. Not emotion exactly. Recognition. Like a man spotting blood beneath snow. "Does it?" he asked quietly. Vivian laughed lightly. "Surely you know how fragile young ladies can become when isolated too long." Isolated by whom? The question landed softly. That somehow made it worse. Eveline felt Vivian's fingers tighten against her wrist for half a second before relaxing again. "You misunderstand," her mother replied with practiced warmth. "Everything I have done has been for Eveline's protection." Lucian finally looked away from Eveline then. Slowly. Deliberately. His pale eyes settled upon Vivian with the same cold stillness winter rivers carried before freezing solid. "Protection," he repeated. "Yes." Vivian smiled again. "The poor girl struggles socially. Loud environments distress her. We have found quiet confinement beneficial during periods of instability." Eveline lowered her gaze immediately. Years of instinct warned her not to react. Not to speak. Not to challenge the story being built around her. Vivian's lies always sounded most convincing when Eveline appeared frightened enough to support them. "I see," Lucian said. But he did not sound convinced. He sounded thoughtful. That frightened Vivian more. Eveline could tell by the way her mother adjusted the pearl bracelet at her wrist. Small movements always betrayed her eventually. "Please sit, Your Grace," Vivian offered quickly. "Breakfast will be served shortly." Lucien did not move toward the sofa. Instead, he crossed the room slowly until he stood beside the fireplace. The heat should have softened him there. It did not. He remained severe somehow. Dark coat, black gloves, sharp lines carved into stillness. Eveline became suddenly aware of how large he was compared to everyone else in the room. Not simply taller, heavier somehow, like gravity itself bent differently around men accustomed to command. "You have no physician here," he observed. Vivian blinked once. "Excuse me?" "No medical staff." His voice remained calm. "No nurse. No attendants trained to manage unstable patients." Vivian's smile thinned. Eveline's condition does not require such dramatic measures. Yet she lives locked beneath the roof. Silence. Thick and immediate. Eveline felt heat crawl slowly up the back of her neck. Vivian released her wrist at last. "You are remarkably interested in my daughter's private care," she replied carefully. Lucien regarded her without expression. "I dislike locked doors." Something moved beneath the surface of his voice then. Briefly. Not anger. Something older, colder, gone almost immediately. But Eveline noticed it. Vivian noticed it too. Her posture shifted subtly. Defensive now. "I fear gossip has exaggerated certain household arrangements," she said. "Eveline is free to move about the estate as she pleases." Lucien looked toward Eveline again. "Is that true?" The question should not have been difficult. It should have been simple. Yes or no. But Eveline's throat closed anyway, because no one had asked her for truth in years. Only obedience. Vivian's eyes landed on her immediately. Smiling eyes. Warning eyes. Eveline knew both versions equally well. "I..." Her voice nearly disappeared. She forced herself to continue. "I prefer quiet spaces." Vivian relaxed instantly. "You see." Lucien studied Eveline for several long seconds. Not judging. Measuring. The silence stretched so long that Eveline began hearing her own heartbeat again. Then the Duke spoke softly. "That was not the question I asked." Something sharp flickered through Vivian's expression before disappearing beneath aristocratic calm. "Your Grace," she said lightly. "Surely this conversation is becoming unnecessarily personal." Lucien ignored her entirely. "Miss Marrow." Eveline looked up before she could stop herself. "When was the last time you left this estate?" Her breath caught. No one had asked her that either. She tried to remember. Spring, perhaps. No, earlier than that. Christmas in London 2 years ago, before Vivian decided crowded society overwhelmed her fragile daughter. Since then, there had only been locked rooms, controlled dinners, carefully monitored appearances at church, and endless whispers about Eveline's poor nerves. "I do not remember," she admitted quietly. The room fell still again. Vivian moved first this time. "Enough." Her voice remained pleasant but harder now beneath the surface. "Eveline tires easily. I will not have her distressed." Lucien Ashbourne turned toward the fire for a moment. His broad shoulders remained perfectly still. "Distress seems unavoidable in this house." Vivian's composure cracked briefly then. Barely. A tightening around her mouth. "I invited you here regarding the land agreements in Northmoor," she reminded him coolly. "Not to interfere in family matters." "Did you?" Lucien asked softly. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded letter sealed with dark wax. "Your letter spent 3 pages discussing your daughter." Eveline saw real alarm flicker across Vivian's face for the first time. "I merely explained her condition." Lucien unfolded the letter slowly. "You described her as emotionally fragile, socially withdrawn, increasingly difficult to manage, and potentially dangerous to herself." Eveline felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. Vivian had written that about her. Not surprising, perhaps, but hearing the words aloud made them suddenly real in a different way. Dangerous to herself. The phrase echoed coldly inside her chest. Lucian continued quietly. You also requested my recommendation regarding a private institution outside London. Eveline stopped breathing. Vivian recovered quickly. I only wish to explore proper treatment options. An asylum. A discreet medical residence. For your daughter. For her own well-being. Lucian folded the letter again with deliberate care. Interesting. No anger entered his voice. No outrage. Somehow that frightened Vivian more than shouting ever could have. Your Grace, she said carefully now. Surely you understand the burden families face when dealing with instability. Lucian looked toward Eveline once more. No, he said. I understand cages. The fire cracked sharply behind him. Eveline stared at him in silence. Something strange moved through her chest then. Not hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope got people hurt. But something had shifted all the same. Because Lucian Ashbourne was looking at the walls she had spent years pretending did not exist. And worse, he saw them clearly. Vivian stepped forward suddenly. Eveline dear, she said brightly. Why do not you wait upstairs while His Grace and I discuss business? There it was. Removal. Isolation. Control returning to familiar shape. Eveline nodded automatically. Of course. She turned toward the door. No, Lucian's voice stopped her instantly. Quiet. Absolute. She froze where she stood. Vivian stared at him. I beg your pardon? Lucian did not take his eyes off Eveline. She stays. 3 words. Nothing more. Yet the entire room seemed to tighten around them. Vivian laughed softly, though no amusement touched her face. Your Grace, this is hardly appropriate. Neither is locking your daughter in an attic. Silence crashed down again. Somewhere beyond the drawing-room windows, winter wind rattled the dead branches lining the estate road. Eveline felt suddenly dizzy. Nobody spoke to Vivian Marrow that way. Nobody cornered her inside her own games. Vivian's expression cooled by degrees. You presume much about matters you do not understand. Lucian stepped away from the fireplace then. Slow. Controlled. Dangerous in the way storms were dangerous before lightning appeared. Then explain them. Vivian opened her mouth. Closed it again. For the first time in Eveline's memory, her mother looked uncertain. Lucian stopped directly beside Eveline. Close enough that she could smell cold air and cedar smoke clinging faintly to his coat. He looked down at her bruised hands still clasped tightly together. Why are you afraid of footsteps? He asked quietly. The question shattered something inside her. Not because it was cruel, because it was precise. Too precise. Eveline's throat tightened painfully. She could not answer. Did not know how to answer. Lucian waited anyway, patient, still, like a man accustomed to silence revealing more than speech ever could. Vivian moved sharply toward them. This conversation is finished. Lucian finally looked at her. No, he said softly. It is only beginning. Vivian Marrow had spent 20 years mastering the art of controlling rooms. She controlled them with beauty, with timing, with smiles sharpened into weapons so elegant people mistook them for manners. But as she stood across from Lucian Ashbourne beside the firelit drawing room, Eveline realized something terrifying for the first time in her life. Her mother was losing control of this one. Vivian folded her hands carefully before her waist. Every movement precise, every breath measured. Your Grace, she said smoothly. Perhaps grief has made you overly suspicious. My daughter is fragile, yes, but she is hardly imprisoned. Lucian remained beside Eveline without moving. The height of him alone altered the room somehow. The servants lingering beyond the doorway had gone completely silent. Even the house itself seemed to listen when he spoke. Then why? He asked quietly. Does she look relieved every time you stop touching her? The question struck harder than shouting ever could have. Eveline felt her stomach tighten painfully. Vivian's expression did not crack this time. It froze, cold and polished as marble. You presume intimacy where there is none, she replied. You have known my daughter for less than half an hour. That is all it took. Silence followed. Heavy. Dangerous. Vivian crossed slowly toward the tea service near the sofa. Porcelain rattled softly as she lifted the silver kettle with perfectly steady hands. Eveline knew that performance. Calmness meant calculation. Her mother was deciding which mask to wear next. Tea, Vivian offered lightly. Lucien did not answer. She poured anyway. You must forgive me if I appear defensive. Raising Eveline alone has required sacrifices most people cannot imagine. Her voice softened beautifully on the last sentence. Vulnerable now. Wounded. The role of devoted mother suited her disturbingly well. My daughter has always struggled emotionally, even as a child. Eveline stared at the floorboards. She knew what came next. The stories. Vivian had spent years building them piece by piece. Little comments whispered through dinner parties. Delicate sighs at church gatherings. Concerned glances whenever Eveline spoke too quietly or withdrew from crowded rooms. By now half the county likely believed she truly was unstable. That was how reputations died among aristocrats. Not loudly, slowly, carefully. After her father's death, Vivian continued gently. She became increasingly withdrawn. Panic attacks, emotional confusion, fear of strangers. Lucien's voice interrupted softly. Fear of you. Vivian set the teacup down harder than intended. The porcelain clicked sharply against the tray. You are crossing a line. Am I? Lucien asked. Or are you simply unaccustomed to being questioned? The firelight shifted across his face as he turned slightly toward her. Eveline noticed then that his left hand bore an old scar running beneath the glove line near his wrist. Pale, thin. He carried himself like a man who understood injuries intimately. You arrived here because of a land agreement, Vivian reminded him carefully. Northmoor shipping routes require Marrow rail access. I assumed this meeting concerned business. It does. Lucien's eyes moved briefly toward Eveline again. I am evaluating liabilities. Vivian went still. Explain yourself. Your estate borders 3 northern trade routes. His tone remained calm. Instability within this household creates unnecessary risk. Eveline frowned faintly. That was not the conversation she expected. Lucien Ashbourne did not seem like a man interested in gossip or domestic disputes. He spoke about risk the way soldiers discussed incoming storms. Vivian recovered quickly. You cannot seriously believe my daughter poses danger to your business interests. No, Lucien looked directly at her. I believe you do. The silence afterward stretched unbearably long. Vivian's mask slipped then. Only slightly, but Eveline saw it. Anger. Real anger. Cold and bright beneath her mother's elegant surface. You know nothing about what it takes to manage her, Vivian said quietly. You see bruises and immediately imagine monsters. Lucien did not blink. Do not mistake observation for imagination. Vivian inhaled slowly through her nose. Eveline has episodes. What kind? Emotional instability. Describe it. Pause. Withdrawal. Fearfulness. Irrational behavior. Such as. Vivian hesitated again. Eveline felt something strange twist inside her chest watching it happen. Her mother always had answers. Immediate ones. Precise ones. Yet Lucien kept forcing spaces into the conversation where lies became difficult to maintain. She isolates herself, Vivian said finally. She becomes difficult to reason with. Lucien turned slightly toward Eveline. Do you? Eveline's throat tightened. Vivian's eyes cut toward her instantly. Warning. Sharp and familiar. Answer his grace properly, her mother said sweetly. The sweetness frightened Eveline more than shouting ever had. She looked down at her clasped hands. I prefer quiet, she whispered. That is not what I asked. Lucien's voice remained calm. Eveline swallowed hard. Nobody had ever continued asking before. Most people accepted the first answer because it was easier, because discomfort made aristocrats nervous. But Lucien Ashbourne stood inside discomfort like he belonged there. Her voice faltered. Sometimes crowds are difficult. Why? Eveline froze. The truth hovered dangerously close beneath her tongue. Because crowded rooms meant people staring while Vivian corrected her posture. Because crowded rooms meant whispered embarrassment if she spoke too loudly or too softly or too much or not enough. Because every public appearance became another test she was designed to fail. Eveline. Vivian's voice sharpened gently. His Grace is not your physician. Lucien finally looked directly at Vivian again. No, he agreed. But I know coercion when I see it. Something dangerous entered the room then. Not loud. Worse than loud. The servants beyond the doorway disappeared entirely now. Eveline heard retreating footsteps fading deeper into the hall. Nobody wanted proximity to whatever this was becoming. Vivian moved toward the fireplace slowly. Her emerald silk dress whispered against the carpet. I think perhaps, she said carefully, you project old wounds onto situations that do not concern you. Lucien's expression did not change, but Eveline saw it again. That brief shift beneath the stillness. Old wounds. The phrase landed somewhere deep enough to matter. Vivian saw it too. Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. People speak about Northmoor, she continued softly. About your late brother. About your family tragedies. Eveline's pulse stumbled. The air itself seemed to tighten around them. Lucien became perfectly motionless. Careful, he said quietly. Vivian smiled faintly. I mean no offense. I merely suggest grief can distort judgment. For the first time since entering the room, Lucien Ashbourne looked dangerous in a visible way. Not because he raised his voice. He did not. Not because he moved aggressively. He barely moved at all. But something inside his stillness hardened suddenly, like a door closing behind stone walls. You invited me here, he said softly. You requested assistance removing your daughter from society permanently. Vivian's composure flickered. That is not what I requested. Lucien withdrew the folded letter from his coat again. Would you like me to read your exact words aloud? Silence. Vivian's face lost color for the first time. Eveline stared at the letter in his hand. She suddenly remembered the long evenings 3 months ago when Vivian remained locked inside her private study writing correspondence by candlelight. Letters carried by trusted servants instead of regular post. Eveline never questioned it then. She questioned everything now. You had no right to bring private correspondence into this conversation, Vivian said quietly. You forfeited privacy the moment you described your daughter as dangerous property. Eveline's breath caught sharply. Property. The word hit her harder than unstable ever had because it felt true. Not metaphorically. Literally. Vivian had managed her for years the way wealthy people managed inconvenient estates. Quietly. Strategically. Removing value where necessary. Lucien unfolded the letter slowly. You wrote that Miss Marrow's condition had become impossible to contain within polite society. Vivian stood rigid beside the fire. Enough. You wrote that confinement had become increasingly difficult. Eveline felt suddenly cold despite the heat filling the room. Stop. Lucien continued anyway. And you asked whether Northmoor maintained private medical facilities capable of permanent care. The silence afterward felt endless. Vivian's breathing became audible now, controlled but heavier than before. Eveline stared at her mother with widening eyes. Permanent care. She understood those words. Aristocratic families hid inconvenient daughters in quiet institutions all the time. Women disappeared into them for exhaustion, grief, anxiety, embarrassment. Some never returned. You intended to send me away, Eveline whispered. Vivian looked toward her sharply. You do not understand what is necessary. Necessary? Eveline repeated faintly. I protected you, Vivian snapped suddenly. The sudden volume shattered the room. You were weak, frightened, impossible to present properly. Every conversation became humiliation. Every appearance an embarrassment waiting to happen. Eveline flinched instinctively before she could stop herself. Lucien saw it immediately. The Duke's gaze sharpened with terrible clarity. Vivian realized her mistake 1 second too late. She straightened quickly, composure rushing back into place. Eveline dear, she said softer now. You know how difficult these discussions become for you. Eveline stared at her mother in silence. Something inside her chest had gone strangely numb. Not pain exactly. Recognition. Like finally seeing the shape of a cage after years trapped inside it. Vivian stepped carefully toward her. "Come upstairs," she said gently. "You need rest." Eveline took one unconscious step backward instead. Straight into Lucian Ashbourne's shadow. The room went completely still. Vivian froze. So did Eveline. She had not meant to do that. Had not even realized she moved until it happened. But suddenly she stood beside the Duke instead of beside her mother. And for the first time in years, Vivian looked uncertain about approaching her own daughter. Lucian lowered his gaze toward Eveline briefly, then back toward Vivian. "Interesting," he said softly. "What is?" Vivian demanded. Lucian's expression remained unreadable. "She moves away from you," he said. "Not toward you." Vivian's face hardened instantly. "You have been in this house less than 1 hour. Long enough." The fire cracked loudly behind them. Outside, snow had begun falling beyond the frost-covered windows. Thick white flakes drifting slowly across the dead gardens of Marrow Estate. Lucian looked toward the storm briefly before returning his attention to Vivian. "I have changed my mind regarding our negotiations." Vivian blinked once. "Excuse me? Northmoor will not proceed with rail agreements under current circumstances." Real alarm flashed across her face now. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." His voice remained terrifyingly calm. "Your household presents instability I find unacceptable." Vivian stepped forward sharply. "Because of her?" Lucian did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Eveline instead. Calm, measuring, unsettlingly attentive. Then finally he spoke. "Because someone in this house is lying." Snow fell harder outside the drawing-room windows, thick white sheets swallowing the dead gardens beyond the glass 1 inch at a time. The storm moved fast across the countryside. Winter always arrived early in this part of England. Eveline stood beside Lucian Ashbourne near the fireplace and watched her mother calculate in silence. Vivian Marrow had lost the room once already today. She would not allow it twice. "I think," Vivian said carefully, "this conversation has become emotional rather than practical." Lucian removed one black leather glove finger by finger. Slow, unhurried. "You mistake calmness for surrender." His bare hand rested at his side afterward. Large, scarred, not aristocratic hands softened by idle living. Eveline noticed the pale marks crossing his knuckles and wrist again. Old injuries, old winters. Vivian noticed them too. "You speak as though you know my daughter," she replied coolly. "You do not." "No," Lucian agreed softly. "But I know fear." Silence settled heavily between them. Eveline lowered her eyes toward the carpet because suddenly she could not bear the weight of his attention. Nobody had looked at her this carefully in years. Not with pity, not with contempt, with concentration. It made her feel exposed in ways Bruises never had. Vivian crossed slowly toward the liquor cabinet beside the west wall. Crystal glasses gleamed beneath candlelight as she poured herself a drink. The sound of amber liquid against glass echoed unnaturally loud through the room. "Your Grace," she said. "You have built an impressive reputation frightening people into obedience. But this is my home." Lucian remained perfectly still. "Homes are meant to be safe." Vivian smiled faintly. "And now you intend to lecture me about motherhood?" "No," he looked toward Eveline again. "I intend to ask why your daughter behaves like a hostage." The crystal glass slipped slightly in Vivian's hand before steadying again. Eveline felt panic tighten suddenly beneath her ribs. This was dangerous now. Truly dangerous. Lucian did not seem to understand how far Vivian would go once cornered. Or perhaps he understood perfectly and simply did not care. "You have crossed every boundary of decency," Vivian said quietly. "Have I?" Lucian asked. "You requested my assistance removing your daughter from public life. You invited me into this house to discuss confinement. Yet now you object because I asked questions. You misunderstand the situation entirely." Then explain it clearly. Vivian inhaled slowly. Eveline suffers from instability inherited from her father's side of the family. Eveline froze. That lie again. The oldest one. Her moods shift unpredictably. She becomes withdrawn for weeks. She struggles with memory and emotional regulation. Lucien's gaze sharpened slightly. Memory? Episodes of confusion. Vivian continued smoothly. She often forgets conversations or invents grievances that never occurred. Eveline stared at her mother in disbelief. The cruelty of it no longer shocked her. But hearing it spoken aloud before another person made humiliation bloom hot beneath her skin. Vivian turned toward her then with perfect maternal sadness painted across her face. "Eveline dear," she said softly, "you know the doctors worried after your collapse last winter. There had been no collapse. Only exhaustion after 3 days locked inside the attic without visitors because Eveline embarrassed her mother during a dinner party by speaking too quietly when addressed by a viscount's son." Lucien spoke before Eveline could respond. "Which doctors?" Vivian blinked once. "Excuse me? Names?" His voice remained calm. "You mentioned physicians evaluating her condition. Which physicians?" A pause. "Brief. Dangerous. Dr. Whitmore primarily." Lucien nodded faintly. "Interesting." Vivian stiffened. "What does that mean?" "Whitmore died 14 months ago." The silence afterward felt like standing beneath cracking ice. Eveline's breath caught sharply. Vivian did not move, did not blink. But something inside her expression fractured almost invisibly. Lucien watched her the way hunters watched wounded things attempting escape. "Perhaps another physician then," he continued softly. "One currently alive." Vivian set her drink down carefully. "I do not appreciate being interrogated in my own drawing room." "Then stop lying in it." The words landed with terrifying softness. Eveline felt the room tilt slightly again. Nobody spoke to Vivian Marrow this way. Nobody survived doing it long. Her mother stepped closer now. Elegant, cold, dangerous in her own polished manner. "You believe bruises tell complete stories," she said quietly. "You think frightened girls are always innocent." Lucien did not answer. Vivian's eyes sharpened. "Do you know what happens when unstable women are left unchecked?" Eveline closed her eyes briefly. Here it came. The performance she knew too well. Concern wrapped around cruelty like ribbon around a knife. "They destroy families," Vivian continued softly. "They invent abuse where discipline existed. They twist affection into oppression because weakness requires villains." Lucien's expression did not change. "And yet your daughter says almost nothing at all." Vivian's jaw tightened. "Because she knows she is unwell." Eveline looked up sharply then. Something inside her chest finally cracked against the weight of it all. "No," she whispered. Both of them looked toward her instantly. Her pulse hammered painfully beneath her throat. Felt panic climbing her ribs like cold water. She had said too much. Far too much. Vivian moved first. "You see?" she snapped sharply toward Lucien. "This is exactly what I mean. Emotional episodes. Delusions." Eveline flinched automatically at the sudden edge in her mother's voice. Lucien noticed immediately. He always noticed. "Enough." The single word stopped the room cold. Vivian turned toward him furiously. "You do not command me." "No," Lucien agreed quietly. "But I do see you." Something dangerous moved beneath Vivian's expression then. Hatred perhaps, or fear finally beginning to resemble itself. "You arrive here uninvited," she said coldly. "You disrupt my household. You provoke my daughter deliberately. For what purpose?" Lucien regarded her silently for several long seconds before answering. "Because someone taught her fear before they taught her trust." Eveline felt her eyes burn suddenly. She looked away quickly before anyone noticed. Vivian laughed once. Sharp and humorless. "You speak as though you intend to rescue her." Lucien's pale eyes remained fixed on Eveline. "Perhaps I do." The air vanished from the room. Eveline stared at him in stunned silence. Vivian looked genuinely shocked for the first time since morning began. Then immediately furious. "Absolutely not." Lucien finally turned toward her. Interesting choice of words. You cannot possibly believe I would permit my daughter to leave with a stranger. A stranger? Lucien repeated softly. You contacted me privately seeking permanent institutional confinement for her. Vivian stepped forward. That was medical necessity. No, Lucien's voice hardened slightly for the first time. It was disposal. Eveline felt cold all over. The word struck too close to truth. Disposal. Remove the inconvenient daughter. Hide the embarrassing girl. Silence the frightened witness. Vivian pointed toward the doorway sharply. Leave this house. Lucien did not move. You are no longer welcome here. Still he remained motionless. The storm outside worsened. Wind rattled violently against the tall windows now. Snow blurred the world beyond the glass into pale emptiness. Lucien looked toward it briefly before speaking again. The roads will close within the hour. Vivian crossed her arms tightly. Then I suppose you should depart quickly. I was not referring to myself. Silence. Eveline looked toward him slowly. Lucien met her gaze directly. Pack a bag, he said quietly. Her heartbeat stopped. Vivian laughed in open disbelief. You cannot be serious. One suitcase. Lucien continued calmly to Eveline as though Vivian had not spoken at all. Warm clothing. Necessary personal items. Eveline could barely breathe. Her voice failed completely. Vivian stepped between them instantly. She is not going anywhere. Lucien's expression remained unreadable. That was not a request. The words landed softly. Absolutely. Eveline watched her mother's face lose color one careful degree at a time. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere deep beneath the storm clouds. The fire snapped violently behind them, and for the first time in 20 years trapped inside Marrow Estate, Eveline realized the impossible might actually be happening. Someone had finally arrived who was not afraid of her mother. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The storm battered the windows hard enough to rattle the glass inside their frames. Snow spiraled across the dark gardens beyond the drawing room like ash carried by violent wind. Eveline stood frozen beside Lucien Ashbourne and stared at him as though she no longer understood the language he was speaking. Pack a bag. The words echoed through her chest with terrifying force because they sounded impossible. People did not leave Marrow Estate. Not really. Servants left. Visitors left. Business associates escaped after dinner parties ended. But Eveline remained. Always. That was the shape of her life. Rooms within rooms within rooms until the world became small enough to survive. Vivian Marrow recovered first. Fury sharpened every elegant line of her face. Absolutely not, she repeated coldly. You will not remove my daughter from this house. Lucien remained perfectly still beside the fire. Interesting choice of phrasing. I beg your pardon? Remove. His pale eyes settled on Vivian with unnerving calm. Not accompany. Not assist. Remove. Vivian crossed her arms tightly against her chest. You twist words deliberately. No, his voice stayed low. I listened to them carefully. Eveline watched her mother struggle to regain control and realize something startling. Vivian was afraid. Not frightened in the trembling sense. Her mother did not tremble, but threatened. Cornered. Eveline had seen foxes look similar once while trapped along the northern woods beyond the estate grounds. Beautiful creatures with nowhere left to run. Your Grace, Vivian said carefully. My daughter is emotionally vulnerable. You cannot possibly expect me to entrust her to a man she has known less than 1 hour. Lucien looked toward Eveline then. Miss Marrow. She startled slightly at the sound of her name in his voice. Do you wish to remain here? Silence swallowed the room whole. Eveline felt both of them watching her now. Vivian with warning. Lucien with impossible patience. Her pulse hammered painfully beneath her ribs. No one had ever asked her what she wanted before. Not genuinely. Choices inside Marrow Estate were performances designed to end the same way every time. Eveline. Vivian's voice softened dangerously. You are overwhelmed. Eveline looked down at her clasped hands. Her fingers had gone numb from tension. Stay quiet, instinct warned her. Stay small. Survive this the way you survive everything else. But another voice had begun whispering beneath the fear now. A quieter voice. A dangerous one. Leave. I asked her, Lucien said softly. Not you. Vivian's jaw tightened visibly. Eveline swallowed hard. Her throat constricted painfully. The room suddenly felt too warm. Too narrow. I do not know. It was the truth. She did not know what freedom looked like anymore. Lucien regarded her silently for several seconds. Then he nodded once as though she had answered something important anyway. Fair enough. Vivian seized the opening immediately. You see? She is confused. Distressed. This entire conversation has been deeply irresponsible. Lucien turned slightly toward the windows where snow continued swallowing the estate outside inch by inch. No, he said quietly. What is irresponsible is locking frightened women in attics until they forget the difference between fear and obedience. Eveline felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. She looked away immediately before anyone noticed. Vivian noticed anyway. She always noticed weakness. Eveline dear, her mother said gently. Come here. The softness in her voice terrified Eveline more than anger ever had. Softness meant strategy. Public softness meant punishment later. Eveline did not move. Vivian's expression sharpened almost invisibly. Now. Lucien stepped slightly forward before Eveline even realized she had flinched. Not dramatic. Barely noticeable. But suddenly the space between mother and daughter no longer felt open. Vivian saw it too. Her face went completely cold. How dare you? Lucien ignored her. Miss Marrow. Eveline looked toward him uncertainly. Go upstairs, he said calmly. Pack what you need for 1 week. Her heartbeat stumbled. 1 week. To begin with. Vivian laughed sharply. This conversation is over. Lucien finally turned toward her fully. The firelight carved hard shadows across his face now. No, he said quietly. It is not. Something in his tone changed then. Not louder. Worse than louder. Final. Vivian sensed it immediately. Eveline watched calculation move rapidly behind her mother's eyes. Anger would not win here. Manipulation might. Vivian softened instantly. Her shoulders lowered. Her voice gentled. Your Grace, she said quietly. Perhaps we began poorly. I understand why appearances concern you. You arrive unexpectedly and see a frightened young woman. Naturally, you assume the worst. Lucien said nothing. Vivian moved toward Eveline slowly now, careful and elegant as snowfall. But you must understand something about my daughter. Eveline attaches easily to rescuers. Eveline went cold. Mother? She becomes emotionally dependent very quickly. Vivian continued sadly. It is part of her condition. Lucien's expression remained unreadable. Vivian pressed forward carefully. 3 years ago she became convinced a stable hand intended to marry her simply because he showed her kindness after a panic episode. Eveline stared at her in horror. That is not true. Vivian sighed softly. You see, you dismissed him because he brought me books. The words escaped before Eveline could stop them. Vivian's eyes flashed warning instantly. Eveline. But Lucien had gone very still beside the fire. Books, he repeated softly. Eveline realized too late she had spoken out of turn. Panic rushed hot beneath her skin. I should not have. What books? Lucien asked quietly. Vivian answered immediately. Poetry. Romantic nonsense. She became fixated. History, Eveline whispered. Both of them looked toward her. He brought history books. Silence followed. Vivian's expression tightened. You barely slept for weeks afterward. Because you fired him. Lucien watched the exchange with frightening concentration. Not interrupting. Not rescuing. Simply watching truths surface one fracture at a time. Eveline suddenly understood why powerful men feared him. He did not force confessions. He waited for lies to collapse beneath their own weight. Vivian turned toward him sharply. You see how unstable these conversations become? Lucien's gaze remained on Eveline. No, he said softly. I see someone apologizing every time she tells the truth. The room fell silent again. Eveline felt something crack painfully inside her chest then. Because he was right. Every sentence she spoke ended with apology. Every opinion softened before it could offend. Every feeling hidden before it became inconvenient. Vivian crossed toward the liquor cabinet again with measured steps. Her control was slipping now around the edges. Eveline could hear it in the way crystal rattled faintly against the tray. You have built an entire fantasy from one afternoon's observation, Vivian said coldly. And you, Lucien replied, have built an entire prison from one woman's fear. Vivian spun toward him. Enough. Lucien reached into his coat pocket slowly. Eveline stiffened instinctively, but instead of documents or letters, he withdrew a small silver pocket watch. He glanced at the time once before closing it again with a soft metallic click. The roads north will vanish beneath snow within 40 minutes. His eyes settled calmly on Eveline. If you intend to leave, it must happen now. The words struck like thunder inside her chest. Leave. Truly leave. The possibility suddenly became real in a terrifying way. Not theory anymore. Not argument. Decision. Vivian stepped forward immediately. She is not going anywhere. You do not own her. She is my daughter. That is not the same thing. Eveline felt dizzy. Her mother looked ready to shatter the entire room apart with bare hands. Lucien looked like winter itself. Still, cold, unmovable. Eveline, Vivian said sharply. Go upstairs immediately. Lucien spoke at the same moment. Miss Marrow. Eveline froze between their voices. Vivian's tone carried 20 years of fear inside it. Lucien's carried something far more dangerous. Choice. If you stay, Lucien said quietly, nothing changes. The room stopped breathing. Eveline stared at him while snow battered the windows behind his broad silhouette. He did not move closer, did not pressure her. That somehow made the words hit harder. But if you leave, he continued softly, then whatever happens next belongs to you. Tears burned suddenly behind Eveline's eyes again. She looked away quickly toward the doorway because the idea felt too enormous to survive touching directly. Belongs to you. No one had ever spoken to her that way before. Not once. Vivian saw the shift happen immediately. Panic flashed beneath her elegant composure at last. Eveline, she snapped. Do not be ridiculous. You barely know this man. No, Lucien said calmly. But she knows you. Silence crashed through the room like breaking glass. Vivian stared at him with naked fury now. Eveline felt her own breathing become uneven. Too fast. Too sharp. She needed to think. Needed space. Needed the attic suddenly with desperate intensity because cages at least were familiar. Lucien seemed to notice her panic immediately. 1 week, he said quietly to her. No obligations. No decisions beyond that. Eveline looked toward him uncertainly. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Why would a man like Lucien Ashbourne involve himself in this? Why risk political conflict over a frightened woman hidden inside somebody else's estate? Lucien regarded her for a long moment. Snowlight flickered pale against his scarred hands. Because, he said softly, someone should have asked whether you wanted saving before they decided you were beyond it. Eveline felt her composure finally break then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that she turned away sharply toward the doorway before either of them could see tears sliding silently down her face. Vivian moved instantly. Do not walk away while I am speaking to you. Eveline stopped automatically. Years of obedience locked into muscle before thought. Lucien noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything. Go pack your bag, he said quietly. Vivian stepped forward furiously. She will not leave this house. Lucien finally looked directly at her again. Calm, cold, certain. Then stop her yourself. Eveline stood frozen in the center of the drawing room while the storm battered Marrow Estate hard enough to shake the windows inside their frames. Nobody spoke after Lucien's final words. Then stop her yourself. The silence that followed felt alive somehow. Sharp enough to cut breathing into pieces. Vivian Marrow stared at the Duke with naked fury burning beneath her polished expression. But underneath the fury lived something new now. Uncertainty. Eveline had never seen it before. Her mother always controlled outcomes, always knew exactly where every conversation would end. But Lucian Ashbourne had walked into the house like winter crossing a battlefield. Cold, slow, impossible to redirect once moving. Eveline lowered her eyes toward the carpet because suddenly she could not bear looking at either of them. Her pulse hammered painfully beneath her throat. Leave. The word kept echoing through her mind in terrifying circles. Leave the attic. Leave the estate. Leave the carefully measured prison that had shaped every inch of her adult life. Fear rose immediately after the thought. Huge. Suffocating. What if freedom was worse? What if Vivian had been right all along? What if the world beyond Marrow Estate truly had no place for women like her? Eveline. Her mother's voice softened suddenly. Too suddenly. Come here. Eveline did not move. Darling. That word. She only used darling when witnesses existed. You are frightened. Of course you are. His Grace has overwhelmed you with dramatic accusations. Lucian remained silent beside the fireplace. Watching. Waiting. Eveline hated how aware she had become of him standing there. The room itself seemed altered around his presence. Safer somehow. Which was absurd. Men like Lucian Ashbourne did not become safe. They became feared. Vivian stepped closer slowly. You know I have only ever protected you. Eveline swallowed hard. Protected me from what? The question escaped before she could stop it. Vivian blinked once as though startled her daughter had spoken at all. From humiliation, she answered softly. From cruel people. From yourself sometimes. By locking me upstairs? By shielding you. Lucian finally moved then, only one step away from the fire, yet somehow the entire room tightened around it. Enough! Vivian turned sharply toward him. Do not interfere in matters you do not understand. I understand isolation. His voice remained calm. I understand fear taught slowly enough that it begins sounding like loyalty. Eveline felt cold move down her spine because he spoke as though he knew exactly what living inside Marrow Estate felt like. Not guessed. Knew. Vivian laughed once. Brittle and sharp. You speak as though you know my daughter's mind. No, Lucian said quietly. I know yours. Silence crashed down again. Eveline heard footsteps lingering somewhere beyond the hall. Servants listening. The entire house had probably stopped breathing by now. Vivian realized it too. Public image mattered more to her than almost anything. She straightened carefully and smoothed invisible wrinkles from her emerald silk sleeves. Very well, she said coolly. If His Grace insists on creating spectacle, then let us proceed practically. Lucian said nothing. Eveline will not travel north during a storm. The roads remain passable for another 30 minutes. And after that? Then she stays overnight at Northmoor Lodge in Briar Glen. Vivian folded her arms tightly. Absolutely not. Lucian regarded her without expression. You continue mistaking your preferences for authority. Eveline felt panic tighten beneath her ribs again. The conversation had become too large. Too fast. She needed space to think. Needed the attic. Needed familiar walls and cold windows and silence. I cannot do this, she whispered suddenly. Both of them looked toward her instantly. Eveline stepped backward unconsciously. I cannot just leave. Vivian seized the opening immediately. Of course you cannot. You are distressed. No, Eveline pressed trembling fingers against her temple. I mean, her breathing became uneven. I do not know how. The words humiliated her the moment they escaped. 20 years old, and she did not know how to leave a house. Tears burned hot behind her eyes again. Vivian softened immediately. Victorious softness now. There now, she murmured gently. You see? She is confused. She needs stability. Lucian's gaze never left Eveline's face. Miss Marrow. She looked toward him uncertainly. What is the first thing you would pack? The question startled her completely. What? If you left for 1 week, he said calmly. What would you take first? Eveline blinked rapidly. The simplicity of the question cut through panic in an unexpected way. Not forever. Not escape. 1 week. Her mind moved automatically toward practical things. A wool coat, perhaps. Her father's old books hidden beneath the attic floorboards. The small silver locket Mrs. Porter once gave her after a particularly difficult winter. Books, she whispered before thinking. Vivian closed her eyes briefly like someone enduring disappointment. Lucien nodded once. Good. Eveline frowned faintly. Good. People planning surrender do not think about books. Silence followed. Strange silence this time. Softer somehow. Eveline stared at him uncertainly while snowlight flickered pale across his scarred hands. You think this is bravery? Vivian snapped sharply. It is manipulation. Lucien ignored her completely. Fear narrows the world, he said quietly to Eveline. You have lived inside narrow spaces too long. The words struck painfully close. Eveline looked away toward the windows because suddenly breathing felt difficult again. Outside, the storm had swallowed almost everything. The gardens, the frozen lake, the long road winding through dead trees toward the main gate. White erased the world inch by inch. Vivian crossed the room suddenly and stopped directly before Eveline. Too close. Instinct made Eveline tense immediately. Look at me. Eveline obeyed automatically. This man arrives uninvited, Vivian said softly. He fills your head with fantasies after one afternoon, and suddenly you believe your entire life has been cruelty. Mother, do you truly think the world beyond this house is kind? Vivian's voice dropped lower, sharper. Women without protection disappear every day. You are frightened by dinner parties, Eveline. What exactly do you think waits for you outside these walls? Panic surged again instantly. Vivian saw it happen and pressed harder. You cannot even maintain conversation with strangers without trembling. Enough. Lucien's voice cut cleanly across the room. Vivian ignored him. You believe this Duke intends rescue because he enjoys playing hero. But powerful men grow bored quickly. And then what becomes of frightened girls left behind? Eveline felt dizzy again. The room tilted slightly beneath her feet. Vivian stepped closer still. You survive because I built this house around your weaknesses. Lucien moved before Eveline even realized he had crossed the room. One moment he stood beside the fireplace. The next he stood between them. Not aggressively. Not touching either woman. Yet suddenly Vivian could no longer crowd her daughter with words sharpened into weapons. Step back, Lucien said quietly. Vivian stared at him in disbelief. You cannot order me inside my own home. Watch me. The storm thundered outside. Eveline's breathing sounded too loud now inside the drawing room silence. Lucien looked down toward her briefly. How many locked doors separate your attic from the front entrance? The question startled her. What? Answer. 3. Her voice came quietly. The attic door. The west staircase gate at night. The north hall. Lucien nodded once as though confirming something privately. Vivian went pale. That is for security. Against whom? Lucien asked softly. Vivian opened her mouth. Closed it again. Eveline stared at the floorboards, suddenly unable to look at anyone. Because hearing the number spoken aloud made the truth unavoidable. 3 locked barriers between her and the outside world. Not protection. Containment. Lucien's voice gentled slightly when he spoke again. Miss Marrow. She looked up slowly. Go upstairs. Panic flickered instantly again. One bag, he continued calmly. Warm clothes. Your books. His pale eyes remained steady on hers. Nothing else tonight. Eveline swallowed hard. And if I cannot? Lucien regarded her for several long seconds before answering. Then I will leave. The room went still. Eveline stared at him in surprise. Vivian looked equally shocked. You would simply walk away? She demanded. If she asks me to. Lucien's gaze never left Eveline's face. Choice matters. Something inside Eveline's chest cracked softly then. Because every person in her life had always decided things for her. Doctors, servants, her mother. Even silence decided things eventually. But Lucian Ashbourne stood inside the storm and offered something infinitely more frightening than rescue. Decision. Her own. Vivian sensed the shift immediately. Fear flashed behind her elegant composure again. "Eveline," she said sharply, "do not be foolish." Eveline looked toward her mother slowly. Really looked this time. At the perfect posture. The expensive emerald silk. The carefully controlled mouth that had shaped her entire life through approval and punishment measured so precisely they became indistinguishable. "If I stay," Eveline whispered, "will anything change?" Vivian froze, just for a second. But it was enough. Enough for Eveline to finally understand the answer. No, nothing would ever change here. The attic, the locked doors, the whispers about instability, the careful shrinking of her world until she disappeared quietly inside it. Lucian remained completely silent beside her. Waiting, not pushing. That somehow made the moment feel even more terrifying. Because now the next step belonged entirely to her. Eveline inhaled shakily, then turned toward the doorway before courage vanished completely. Vivian's voice cut sharply after her. "Where do you think you are going?" Eveline stopped at the threshold. Her hands trembled violently. Her heartbeat thundered inside her ears. But when she finally spoke, her voice came quieter than fear and stronger than obedience all at once. "To pack my books." The hallway outside the drawing room felt colder than before. Eveline walked quickly through the long marble corridor while her pulse hammered so violently she could hear it above the storm outside. Behind her, silence remained trapped inside the west drawing room like something waiting to explode. She knew her mother well enough to understand what that silence meant. Vivian Marrow was thinking, calculating, rearranging the world into weapons. Eveline climbed the staircase toward the attic 2 steps at a time before fear could catch up with her completely. The mansion seemed strangely alive tonight. Servants appeared and vanished through side corridors carrying candles and blankets, while snow lashed violently against the windows. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke. But everywhere she passed, people stared. Some with curiosity. Some with pity. One young kitchen maid crossed herself quickly when Eveline moved past. As though frightened women carried contagious things. The attic hallway greeted her with familiar cold. Thin drafts leaked through the old stone walls and turned the narrow corridor into something halfway between a prison and a crypt. Eveline stopped outside her attic door and pressed trembling fingers against the wood before entering. 1 week. The words still did not feel real. She pushed the door open slowly. Her tiny room waited exactly as she left it. The narrow bed beneath the slanted ceiling. The cracked mirror. The frost-covered circular window overlooking dead winter trees beyond the estate. Everything looked painfully small suddenly. She crossed toward the bed and sat down hard enough to shake the thin mattress beneath her. Her breathing would not steady. Leave. Truly leave. The thought felt too enormous to survive touching directly. She looked around the attic room carefully. 20 years old, and nearly every meaningful possession she owned fit inside 4 walls no larger than 12 feet wide. The realization hurt in ways she could not explain. A soft knock sounded suddenly at the door. Eveline startled violently before catching herself. "Miss Eveline." Mrs. Porter's voice came quietly through the wood. "May I come in?" Eveline swallowed hard. "Yes." The housekeeper entered carrying a small oil lamp and stopped short the moment she noticed Eveline sitting motionless on the bed. Mrs. Porter had worked at Marrow Estate for 16 years. Long enough to understand silence inside this house better than most people understood language. "Good heavens," she whispered softly. "You really are leaving?" Eveline looked down at her trembling hands. "I do not know." Mrs. Porter closed the attic door carefully behind her and crossed the room. "The servants downstairs are terrified." Eveline managed a faint, humorless laugh. "Of me? Of him?" The older woman set the lamp beside the washstand. "Nobody has ever spoken to your mother that way before." Eveline stared toward the frosted window. "Neither have I." Mrs. Porter studied her quietly for several seconds. "You should pack quickly. Do you think he means it?" The housekeeper frowned slightly. "What? Taking me away?" Mrs. Porter became very still. Miss Eveline. Her voice softened. Men like the Duke of Ashbourne do not say things they do not mean. Silence settled gently between them. Outside, wind howled across the roof hard enough to make the attic rafters groan softly overhead. Eveline wrapped her arms around herself. I do not even know why he came here. Mrs. Porter hesitated. Perhaps because he saw something wrong. Eveline looked up sharply. Everyone saw something wrong. The older woman's expression turned sad then. No, child. Everyone saw. But seeing and acknowledging are different things. That hurt more than Eveline expected. Because it was true. Servants noticed bruises. Guests noticed trembling hands. The county noticed her disappearance from society one careful season at a time. But nobody said anything because polite people survived by pretending cruelty belonged elsewhere. Mrs. Porter crossed toward the narrow wardrobe and opened it gently. What would you like packed? Eveline stared blankly at the dresses hanging inside. Gray wool. Faded blue cotton. 3 winter gowns altered so many times they barely resembled their original shape. Vivian preferred modest colors lately. Pale women looked more fragile in muted fabric. I do not know, Eveline whispered again. The housekeeper glanced toward her carefully. Then start with what matters. What mattered? The question lingered heavily inside the attic room. Eveline rose slowly from the bed and crossed toward the loose floorboard beneath the small writing desk by the window. She knelt carefully and lifted the wood panel free with shaking fingers. Mrs. Porter watched silently while Eveline withdrew 3 weathered books wrapped in cloth to protect them from dust and damp. History of the Northern Territories. Maritime Trade and Border Law. A worn poetry collection missing its spine. The housekeeper smiled faintly when she saw them. You kept them. Eveline brushed dust gently from the top volume. I read them at night. Your mother would not approve. That is why I hid them. Mrs. Porter became quiet for a moment. Then softly she asked, Did she truly fire that stable hand over books? Eveline nodded once. Thomas. Saying his name aloud after so long felt strange. He used to leave them in the greenhouse for me because mother thought history made women argumentative. The housekeeper sighed softly beneath her breath. You liked him. Eveline shook her head immediately. No, not like that. Then after a pause she added quietly, I liked that he spoke to me normally. The older woman's face changed at those words. Sadness again. Deep sadness. Because people should not starve for ordinary kindness the way Eveline had learned to starve for it. Mrs. Porter began folding dresses carefully into a small travel case while Eveline gathered the hidden books against her chest. The attic suddenly felt unbearably tight around her. Every object inside carried memory, fear, survival. Miss Eveline, the housekeeper said carefully after a moment. May I ask you something? Eveline nodded faintly. Are you frightened of the Duke? The question startled her. She considered it honestly. Lucian Ashbourne frightened everyone. That much seemed unavoidable. But not in the same way Vivian frightened her. Vivian frightened through unpredictability. Through smiles that hid punishment. Through control so complete it rewrote reality itself. Lucian frightened differently. Like storms frightened. Like deep water frightened. Honest dangers. Visible ones. I think, Eveline said slowly, he notices things. Mrs. Porter almost smiled. That is what frightens your mother. A sudden knock sounded downstairs somewhere deep within the estate. Loud, sharp, then another. Eveline stiffened immediately. Mrs. Porter crossed quickly toward the attic door and listened. Voices echoed faintly upward from the lower hall. Male voices this time. Deep. Unfamiliar. The housekeeper's expression changed. His men, she whispered. Eveline's pulse stumbled. He brought men after all. Not many perhaps, but enough. Mrs. Porter opened the attic door carefully and peered into the dark staircase below. Footsteps echoed upward through the manor. Heavy boots against marble floors. Controlled movement. Military movement. Eveline rose slowly from the floor, clutching her books tighter against her chest. What is happening? I do not know. The housekeeper sounded uneasy now. Then suddenly another voice drifted upward through the stairwell below. Calm. Low. Instantly recognizable. Lucian. Search the north corridor first. Eveline froze completely. Mrs. Porter looked back toward her with alarm. Search. The word barely escaped Eveline's throat. Before either woman could move, rapid footsteps thundered somewhere downstairs. Then a male servant's panicked voice echoed upward from the lower hall. Your Grace. Silence followed briefly. Then the servant again. Breathless now. The side gate is open. Every drop of warmth vanished from Eveline's body at once. Mrs. Porter stared toward the stairwell. Dear God. Eveline's heartbeat turned violent. The north side gate. The isolated servants' exit near the old carriage road. Nobody used it during winter because the path iced over dangerously after sunset. Unless they intended leaving quietly. Running. A terrible realization struck her instantly. Mother. Mrs. Porter looked toward her sharply. Then understanding flooded the older woman's face too. Vivian Marrow was not surrendering control. She was escaping it. And suddenly Eveline understood something infinitely more frightening than locked attics or whispered threats. Her mother had never truly believed Lucian Ashbourne would stop looking once he began asking questions. Footsteps climbed the staircase fast now. Heavy. Controlled. Coming directly toward the attic. Eveline instinctively stepped backward until the edge of the bed hit behind her knees. Mrs. Porter moved protectively in front of her just as Lucian Ashbourne appeared at the top of the stairs. Snow clung across the shoulders of his black coat. His pale eyes swept the attic room once before landing immediately on Eveline. Get your things, he said quietly. Eveline swallowed hard. What happened? Lucian held her gaze for one long, unreadable second. Then he answered softly. Your mother is gone. The attic seemed to lose all sound after those 4 words. Your mother is gone. Eveline stared at Lucian Ashbourne from across the narrow room while snow clung to the dark shoulders of his coat and melted slowly onto the warped wooden floorboards beneath him. Mrs. Porter still stood protectively between them, though even she seemed too stunned to move. Gone. Eveline whispered finally. Lucian nodded once. She left through the north gate less than 10 minutes ago. Eveline struggled to understand the sentence. Vivian Marrow did not run from situations. She orchestrated them, controlled them, bent them carefully until everyone else broke instead. Yet suddenly Eveline imagined her mother climbing into a carriage beneath the storm with silk gloves and fury, and fear hidden beneath perfect posture. The image felt impossible. Why would she leave? Mrs. Porter asked quietly. Lucian's pale eyes settled briefly on the older woman. Because she realized I was not here about rail contracts. Silence followed. The storm groaned against the roof overhead hard enough to shake frost loose from the attic window. Eveline tightened her hold around the books pressed against her chest. Then why are you here? She asked softly. Lucian looked at her for several long seconds before answering. That is a more complicated question. Mrs. Porter frowned faintly. Your Grace, if Mrs. Marrow fled, should someone not alert the authorities? Already done. Lucian removed his gloves slowly while speaking. 2 of my men rode toward Briar Glen 15 minutes ago. Eveline felt a fresh wave of panic tighten through her stomach. You sent men after my mother? Lucian's expression did not change. I sent men to ensure she does not disappear before answering certain questions. The words settled heavily inside the attic room. Questions. Eveline suddenly understood this had never been about one frightened girl hidden upstairs. Something larger moved beneath the surface. Something Lucian Ashbourne had recognized almost immediately after entering Marrow Estate. What questions? She whispered. Lucian studied her face quietly. Did your mother ever speak to you about your aunt? Eveline blinked in confusion. My aunt. Your father's sister. The room went very still. Eveline tried to remember the last time anyone mentioned Aunt Eleanor aloud inside the estate. Years perhaps. She died, Eveline answered slowly. Before I was born. Lucian remained motionless beside the doorway. That is what you were told? Unease slipped coldly beneath Eveline's ribs. What does that mean? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed slowly toward the small circular attic window and looked out into the white storm swallowing the estate grounds. Northmoor and Marrow families have shared business interests for nearly 30 years, he said quietly. Shipping routes, border investments, property holdings. Eveline frowned faintly. I do not understand. Your father once owned nearly 40% of the northern trade corridor running through Briar Glen. Her confusion deepened. Mother said father left enormous debt. He did. Lucien's reflection flickered faintly against the frost-coated window glass. But not enough to destroy the estate. Silence. Eveline felt the room tilt slightly again. What are you saying? Lucien turned toward her fully then. I am saying your mother lied about the scale of your father's financial collapse. Mrs. Porter inhaled sharply beneath her breath. Eveline stared at him in disbelief. No, the word escaped automatically. Father lost everything. No, Lucien repeated calmly. He lost control. The distinction hit harder than she expected. Eveline searched his face desperately for signs of manipulation or cruelty or games. She found none. Only certainty. After your father's death, Lucien continued quietly, ownership structures inside the Marrow holdings changed very quickly. Too quickly. Mrs. Porter looked pale suddenly. Dear God. Eveline shook her head faintly. Mother said the creditors forced the transfers. Some creditors existed. Lucien's gaze sharpened slightly. Others were fabricated. Silence crashed heavily through the attic room. Eveline felt suddenly unable to breathe properly. That is impossible. No, Lucien's voice remained low and controlled. Merely expensive. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew several folded documents bound together with dark ribbon. I visited London 3 days ago after receiving your mother's letter requesting institutional confinement. Eveline stared at the papers in his hand. You investigated us. I investigated her. The correction landed softly. Terribly. Lucien crossed toward the narrow writing desk and placed the documents carefully upon the worn surface beside the oil lamp. Your mother expected Northmoor to recommend a discreet private facility willing to isolate wealthy women indefinitely. Eveline's stomach turned cold. She truly meant to send me away. Lucien's expression darkened slightly. Yes. Mrs. Porter lowered herself slowly into the small wooden chair beside the bed, as though her legs no longer trusted themselves. Why? She whispered. Why would she do such a thing? Lucien looked toward Eveline again. Because as long as Miss Marrow remained publicly unstable, she could not legally challenge estate ownership. Silence swallowed the room whole. Eveline stared at him blankly. The words made sense individually. Together they felt monstrous. Challenge ownership? She repeated faintly. Lucien untied the ribbon binding the documents. 3 years ago, your mother transferred primary Marrow assets into a private holding structure under her direct authority. Eveline barely heard the wind anymore. That was after father's death. Yes. Lucien unfolded one document carefully. But several of those assets were not legally hers to transfer. Mrs. Porter pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. Eveline felt numb all over now. Whose were they? Lucien held her gaze directly. Yours. The attic disappeared around her for one terrible second. Eveline stared at him while the storm roared against the roof overhead, and somewhere downstairs servants moved through the frozen estate carrying lamps through corridors suddenly filled with secrets. No, she whispered again. That cannot be true. Lucien did not argue. He simply turned the document toward her beneath the oil lamp glow. Names, dates, signatures. She recognized her father's handwriting immediately. The sight of it hit like grief reopening fresh beneath her ribs. Your father created a protected inheritance structure before your birth, Lucien said quietly. Most of the northern holdings were intended to transfer directly to you upon reaching 21. Eveline's pulse stumbled violently. I am 20. Exactly. Mrs. Porter stared toward Eveline in horror. That is why she wanted the asylum. Lucien nodded once. Institutional confinement would legally suspend Miss Marrow's inheritance authority indefinitely. The room became impossibly small suddenly. Eveline felt trapped inside her own skin. "No," she whispered. "Mother would never." But the words died before finishing because suddenly too many things made sense. The isolation, the rumors about instability, the disappearance from society, the constant insistence that Eveline was fragile and incapable and safer hidden away. None of it had been random cruelty. It had been preparation. Lucien watched realization unfold across her face without interruption. "Your mother believed another year of isolation would make legal intervention nearly impossible," he said quietly, "especially once formal medical recommendations existed." Eveline's knees weakened beneath her. Mrs. Porter rose instantly to steady her before she fell. "Easy now." Eveline barely heard her. "She lied about everything." Lucien's expression remained unreadable. "Not everything." He glanced toward the bruises faint beneath her sleeves. "Only the parts that benefited her." Tears burned suddenly behind Eveline's eyes again, but these felt different from before. Not frightened tears. Betrayed ones. Her entire life inside Marrow Estate rearranged itself brutally in her mind piece by piece. The attic had not merely been punishment. It had been strategy, isolation, control, discrediting. Every careful humiliation designed to make the world doubt her before she ever spoke aloud. "How long have you known?" she whispered. Lucien looked toward the storm beyond the attic window. 3 days. 3 days," Eveline repeated faintly. "And you came anyway?" He turned back toward her slowly. "Your mother's letter raised questions. Most people would have ignored them." Lucien's pale eyes held hers steadily. "Most people prefer comfortable lies." Silence settled again. Softer now somehow. Eveline looked down at the inheritance documents spread across the small writing desk beside her hidden books. Her father's signature stared back from yellowed paper like a ghost trying desperately to reach her across time. "Why would father trust you?" she asked quietly. Lucien went still. Completely still. Something unreadable crossed his face, then vanished almost immediately. "Your father once saved my life," he answered softly. The room quieted further. Even the storm seemed distant suddenly. Eveline stared at him uncertainly. "How?" Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. "That story belongs to another winter." He said nothing more after that. Yet something heavy lingered beneath the words. Something old. Mrs. Porter crossed slowly toward the writing desk and looked down at the inheritance papers with trembling disbelief. "Dear God," she whispered again. "All these years." Eveline wrapped her arms tighter around the books against her chest because suddenly they felt like the only stable things left in the world. "If Mother knew this," she whispered, "then she never intended to let me leave." Lucien's gaze sharpened. No, the single word landed cold and absolute. Eveline looked toward him slowly. "Would she really have sent me away forever?" Lucien did not soften the truth. "Yes." The attic fell silent once more. Wind groaned through the rafters overhead while snow swallowed the world outside inch by inch. Eveline suddenly realized she had come terrifyingly close to disappearing without ever understanding why. Another frightened woman quietly removed from society. Another unstable daughter nobody questioned because wealthy families buried inconvenient truths every day. Mrs. Porter pressed one trembling hand against Eveline's shoulder. "You are leaving tonight," she whispered firmly. Eveline stared at the inheritance documents beneath the flickering lamplight. Then toward Lucien Ashbourne standing beside the frost-covered window like some dark, impossible force dragged in by the storm itself. "Why did you really come here?" she asked again softly. Lucien held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because your aunt disappeared 17 years ago." The room stopped breathing. Eveline felt ice flood slowly through her veins. "What?" Lucien's voice lowered further, rougher somehow now beneath the calm. "And I do not believe Eleanor Marrow died by accident." The attic room seemed to shrink around Eveline after those final words. "I do not believe Eleanor Marrow died by accident." Wind roared across the roof overhead while snow struck the circular window in sharp bursts like handfuls of thrown salt. Nobody moved for several seconds. Mrs. Porter stood beside the writing desk with one trembling hand pressed against her throat. Eveline could barely feel her own fingers anymore around the books clutched tightly against her chest. "My aunt," she whispered faintly. "You think Mother—" The sentence broke apart before she could finish it. Lucian Ashbourne remained near the frost-covered window. Still, silent, terrifyingly certain. "I think your aunt disappeared 2 weeks before signing revised inheritance documents," he said quietly. "And I think your mother benefited from that disappearance immediately afterward." Eveline stared at him in disbelief. "But everyone said Aunt Eleanor drowned." "Yes." His pale eyes settled on her steadily. "That story appeared very quickly." Silence crashed heavily through the attic again. Eveline searched desperately through old memories that barely existed. Her aunt had never truly felt real growing up. More myth than person. A beautiful relative nobody mentioned directly. Sometimes Eveline remembered glimpsing a painted portrait hanging briefly in the West Hall during childhood before Vivian ordered it removed. Other than that, nothing remained except whispers. "Mother hated speaking about her," Eveline said quietly. Lucian nodded once. "That does not surprise me." Mrs. Porter looked pale beneath the lamp glow. "Your Grace," she whispered carefully, "are you suggesting Mrs. Marrow harmed her own sister-in-law?" "I am suggesting Eleanor Marrow knew something valuable shortly before her death." Lucian crossed slowly toward the writing desk where the inheritance documents still lay unfolded beside Eveline's hidden books. "And now another Marrow woman has spent years isolated before reaching inheritance age." Eveline felt suddenly cold all over again. The pattern emerged slowly, horribly. Her aunt vanished before signing documents. Eveline nearly disappeared before turning 21. The similarities felt impossible to ignore once seen clearly. "No," she whispered. "No, Mother could not." But she stopped again because another truth had begun rising beneath the horror. Vivian absolutely could. Eveline had spent years believing cruelty inside Marrow Estate came from disappointment or embarrassment or emotional instability. But what if none of it had ever been emotional at all? What if it had always been practical? Lucian seemed to read the realization across her face. "People become dangerous when wealth and fear combine," he said quietly. Mrs. Porter lowered herself slowly into the wooden chair again. "Dear God." Eveline stared toward the inheritance papers spread across the desk. Her father's signature blurred faintly through gathering tears. "Did Father know?" she asked softly. Lucian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe he suspected something shortly before his death." "Then why did he not stop her?" The question came sharper this time, more desperate. Lucian remained silent for a moment before answering. "Because by then he was already dying." The room fell quiet once more except for the storm beyond the walls. Eveline closed her eyes briefly. Her father existed in fragments inside her memory. Warm hands lifting her onto horses during summer visits to the northern fields. The smell of cedar smoke clinging to his winter coats. Quiet laughter during evenings spent reading beside the library fire before illness slowly hollowed him away piece by piece. Vivian had always said grief made him weak toward the end. But now Eveline wondered how much weakness had truly belonged to illness and how much belonged to betrayal. "You knew him well," she said softly. Lucian looked toward the storm outside again before answering. "Well enough." There was something guarded in his voice now, something old and carefully buried. Eveline noticed it immediately. "You said he saved your life." Lucian remained motionless. "Years ago." "How?" Silence stretched. Mrs. Porter glanced uneasily between them. Then finally Lucian spoke. "During the border conflicts 18 years ago, I was stationed near Blackwater Ridge." His voice lowered slightly, rougher somehow beneath the calm. "An ambush destroyed most of my unit during winter transport." Eveline listened carefully. Lucian never volunteered information. Every word from him seemed measured before release. "Your father found us 3 days later," he continued quietly. "Half frozen, nearly starving." Eveline stared at him. "He rescued you?" "Yes." Lucian's pale gaze drifted briefly toward the scarred hand resting beside the documents. "He also ignored direct orders to leave me behind." Silence settled softly between them. Eveline tried imagining her father younger, strong enough to drag wounded soldiers through snowstorms and survive border wars. The image felt strangely comforting. Why would he risk that? She asked. Lucien finally looked directly at her again. Because your father believed abandoned people deserved another chance. Something tightened painfully inside Eveline's chest then. She looked away quickly toward the frosted window before emotion overwhelmed her completely. Vivian had spent years telling her she inherited weakness from her father. Yet suddenly weakness sounded very different from kindness. Mrs. Porter rose slowly from the chair. Miss Eveline should leave immediately, she said quietly. If Mrs. Marrow realizes these documents still exist. She already knows, Lucien interrupted calmly. Eveline's stomach turned cold. What do you mean? Lucien gathered the inheritance papers carefully back into their ribbon binding. Your mother fled because she realized I found evidence connecting the altered estate transfers to Eleanor Marrow's disappearance. Then she will destroy everything, Mrs. Porter whispered. No, Lucien's expression hardened slightly. She will attempt damage control first. Eveline frowned faintly. Meaning your mother built her reputation carefully over 2 decades. Wealthy widows do not abandon estates during snowstorms without explanation. He slipped the documents back inside his coat. She needs a narrative before society notices her panic. Eveline understood immediately. Vivian would not simply vanish. She would create another story, another explanation, another elegant lie polished smooth enough for aristocrats to swallow comfortably. She will say I am unstable, Eveline whispered. Lucien met her gaze evenly. Yes, the honesty hurt, but strangely it also steadied something inside her. No false reassurance, no comforting dishonesty, only truth. Then nobody will believe me, she said quietly. They will if I do. Silence. Eveline stared at him uncertainly. Men like Lucien Ashbourne did not offer loyalty lightly. The realization unsettled her almost as much as it comforted her. A sudden knock sounded downstairs somewhere deep within the estate. Heavy. Urgent. Lucien's expression sharpened immediately. Another knock followed. Then hurried footsteps echoed upward through the lower corridors. Mrs. Porter moved quickly toward the attic doorway and listened tensely. Someone arrived, she whispered. Eveline felt panic return instantly. Mother! Lucien shook his head once. No, his attention remained fixed toward the stairwell now. Listening. Measuring. Too many horses. Footsteps climbed rapidly through the house below. Male voices. Sharp. Controlled. One of Lucien's men appeared moments later at the top of the attic stairs breathing hard from exertion. Snow covered his dark coat nearly shoulder deep. Your Grace. Lucien turned slightly toward him. Report. We searched the north carriage road. The man removed his gloves quickly. Mrs. Marrow abandoned her first carriage near Briar Glen. Eveline frowned faintly. Abandoned? Yes, miss. The soldier glanced toward her respectfully before returning attention to Lucien. Another coach picked her up approximately 2 miles east near the Old Chapel Road. Lucien's expression darkened instantly. How many riders? 4. Silence. Heavy and immediate. Lucien went very still beside the attic window. Professional. Yes, Your Grace. The room tightened sharply around those words. Eveline felt fresh unease crawl beneath her skin. What does that mean? She asked quietly. Lucien looked toward her slowly. It means your mother expected pursuit. Mrs. Porter looked horrified. Dear God. The soldier continued carefully. There is something else. Lucien's gaze sharpened. Speak. The second carriage carried blackthorn insignia. The attic went silent. Lucien's entire expression changed then. Not dramatically. Worse than dramatic. Controlled anger settled across his features like winter hardening rivers into ice. Eveline had never seen him look truly dangerous until now. Blackthorn, he repeated softly. The soldier nodded once. Yes, Your Grace. Eveline looked uncertainly between them. Who are the Blackthorns? Lucien did not answer immediately. His scarred hand tightened faintly at his side. Northern financiers, he said finally. And political opportunists. Mrs. Porter stared in alarm. Those men are infamous. Eveline felt cold move slowly through her stomach. Why would Mother seek them out? Lucien's pale eyes settled directly on hers. Because someone inside that family helped alter your inheritance records 15 years ago. Silence crashed through the attic room once more. The storm outside howled louder, as though the entire estate itself had begun warning them to run. Eveline clutched the books tighter against her chest. You think they worked together? I know they did. Lucien crossed toward the attic doorway, then stopped abruptly as though remembering something. He turned back toward Eveline slowly. Miss Marrow. Her pulse stumbled beneath the sudden sharpness in his voice. Yes. Has your mother ever forbidden you from entering the West Wing library? Confusion flickered briefly through her fear. Always. Lucien's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? She said the floorboards were unsafe after the fire years ago. Silence. Dangerous silence. Then Lucien spoke one quiet sentence that made the entire attic seem to freeze around her. There was never a fire in the West Wing. The attic room fell completely silent after Lucien's final sentence. There was never a fire in the West Wing. Eveline stared at him while wind battered the roof overhead and snow swirled violently against the tiny circular window beside the bed. Her entire childhood shifted uneasily inside her memory. The West Wing library had always remained locked, dark, untouched. Vivian claimed unstable beams and smoke damage made the corridor dangerous after a winter fire years ago. Servants avoided discussing it entirely. Eveline never questioned the story because children raised inside fear eventually stopped questioning locked doors. No, she whispered faintly. I remember the boards covering the entrance. Lucien's pale gaze remained steady on hers. The boards were installed afterward. Mrs. Porter looked horrified. Dear God! The soldier near the attic doorway shifted uneasily beneath the tension filling the room. Lucien turned toward him briefly. Have the east corridor secured? Yes, Your Grace. The man nodded immediately before disappearing back down the narrow staircase. Silence returned once more. Eveline wrapped her arms tighter around the books pressed against her chest because suddenly she felt 16 different kinds of cold all at once. Why would Mother lie about the library? She asked quietly. Lucien crossed slowly toward the attic desk and extinguished one flickering oil lamp before answering. Because whatever remains inside that wing mattered enough to hide for 17 years. The words settled heavily through the room. Mrs. Porter pressed trembling fingers against the edge of the desk. You think evidence is still there? Possibly. Lucien looked toward the storm outside. Or records your mother failed to destroy. Eveline stared at him in disbelief. You came here searching for documents. No, his voice remained low and calm. I came searching for Eleanor Marrow. Silence followed immediately. Eveline frowned faintly. But you said she disappeared 17 years ago. Lucien's jaw tightened slightly. Yes. Then how could you still search for her? For the first time since arriving at Marrow Estate, Lucien Ashbourne hesitated. Not visibly, perhaps. Another person might have missed it entirely. But Eveline noticed because she had spent years learning how silence changed shape around painful truths. Lucien finally spoke without looking directly at her. Bodies are easier to bury than questions. The controlled stillness. The exhaustion hidden deep beneath composure. Something about Eleanor Marrow mattered to him in ways far beyond inheritance disputes and missing records. Mrs. Porter appeared to realize it too. Your Grace, she said carefully. Forgive my boldness, but why would a duke involve himself in something buried nearly 2 decades ago? Lucien remained silent for several long seconds. Then finally he answered, because Eleanor asked me for help 3 days before she vanished. The room stopped breathing again. 3 days before her disappearance, she sent another letter. His scarred hand tightened faintly at his side. She claimed someone inside Marrow Estate had altered financial ledgers connected to northern trade investments. Eveline felt cold creep steadily down her spine. Mother. Lucien nodded once. Eleanor intended to expose the transfers publicly. Silence. Heavy and devastating. Then she vanished. Eveline whispered. Yes. His answer came instantly. The official story claimed she drowned after a carriage accident near Briar Glen. Lucien finally looked directly at Eveline again. No carriage was ever recovered. Mrs. Porter inhaled sharply. Eveline felt suddenly dizzy. And nobody questioned that? I did. Something dark crossed Lucien's expression briefly. Which is why your mother spent the next 17 years ensuring I never gained legal access to Marrow records. Eveline stared toward the inheritance papers hidden inside Lucien's coat. Everything connected now in terrible ways. Eleanor vanished. Her father weakened. The estate transfers changed. Then Eveline herself became isolated before reaching inheritance age. The pattern felt too precise to dismiss as coincidence. You think Mother destroyed evidence in the West Wing. I think she hid something there she could not risk moving publicly. Lucien crossed toward the attic doorway again. And now she fled before I could search the estate properly. Mrs. Porter rose quickly. Then we should leave immediately. Yes. Lucien's attention returned to Eveline. The storm will worsen within the hour. Eveline nodded faintly, but her legs still refused to move. Too many truths had arrived too quickly. Her mother lied. Her inheritance was stolen. Her aunt may not have died accidentally. And somewhere beneath all of it stood Lucien Ashbourne carrying 17 years of unfinished grief behind controlled silence. Why did you never stop searching? She asked quietly. Lucien held her gaze for a long moment. Because Eleanor deserved better than disappearance. The simplicity of the answer hurt unexpectedly. Eveline looked away toward the frost-covered window because suddenly tears burned again behind her eyes. Not from fear this time. From the realization that someone had mourned her aunt all these years while the rest of society accepted a convenient lie. A loud crash echoed suddenly from downstairs. Everyone froze instantly. Another crash followed. Then shouting. Male voices. Sharp and urgent. Lucien's entire posture changed at once. Controlled. Alert. Dangerous. Stay here, he ordered quietly. Eveline's pulse jumped violently. What was that? Lucien moved toward the stairwell without answering. Mrs. Porter rushed after him. Your Grace. One of Lucien's men appeared halfway up the staircase, breathing hard. We found movement near the west corridor. Lucien's expression hardened immediately. How many? Unknown. 2 servants claimed someone entered through the old gallery entrance. Eveline felt cold spread instantly through her stomach. Mother came back? No, Lucien's voice turned sharp as steel. She would not return herself. He looked toward the soldier. Blackthorn men? Possibly. Silence crashed through the attic. Mrs. Porter went pale. They came here. Lucien's eyes narrowed slightly toward the dark hallway beyond the attic staircase. They came for something. Eveline clutched the books tighter against her chest. The library. Lucien looked toward her immediately. Yes. Another crash echoed downstairs, followed by muffled shouting. Lucien reached inside his coat and withdrew a revolver from beneath the dark wool fabric. The sight of it stole breath from Eveline's lungs. Not because she feared weapons. Because until that moment everything still felt partly unreal. Family secrets. Inheritance papers. Hidden rooms. But now armed men moved somewhere beneath the same roof while snow buried the estate outside. Suddenly this was no longer merely scandal. It was danger. Real danger. Lucien checked the weapon calmly before returning his attention to Eveline. Miss Marrow. She looked at him quickly. If anyone besides my men reaches this attic, you lock the door immediately. Panic surged beneath her ribs. What about you? I will manage. Mrs. Porter stepped protectively closer to Eveline. Your Grace, you cannot search the West Wing alone. I am not searching. His pale eyes sharpened toward the dark stairwell. I am intercepting. Another distant shout echoed through the mansion below. Closer this time. Eveline's heartbeat thundered painfully inside her ears. Lucien stepped toward the staircase, then stopped abruptly. He looked back toward Eveline one final time. Did your aunt ever leave you anything? Confusion flickered through her fear. What? A letter. A key. Jewelry. Anything unusual. Eveline shook her head immediately. No, then suddenly she froze. A memory surfaced without warning. Small, strange, buried beneath years of silence. Wait! Lucien turned back instantly. What is it? Eveline frowned faintly, trying to grasp the memory before it vanished again. When I was little, she whispered slowly, Mrs. Porter once gave me a music box. The older housekeeper blinked in surprise. The silver one? Eveline nodded. Mother hated it. She said it belonged in storage. Lucien went completely still. Where is it now? Eveline looked toward the cracked mirror beside the washstand. Hidden. Silence. Dangerous silence. Lucien crossed toward her immediately. Show me. Eveline moved quickly toward the loose stone beneath the mirror base and knelt beside it with trembling fingers. She pulled the stone free carefully before reaching into the hollow space behind it. Dust coated her sleeve as she withdrew a small tarnished silver music box wrapped tightly in faded cloth. Lucien stared at it the moment she uncovered the surface engraving. His entire expression changed. Dear God, he whispered softly. Eveline looked up sharply. What? Lucien reached for the music box with uncharacteristic urgency. On the silver lid, nearly worn away by time, a delicate crest remained faintly visible beneath years of scratches and dust. A raven surrounded by winter roses. Lucien's voice lowered almost to nothing. This belonged to Eleanor. Lucien Ashbourne held the silver music box in both hands as though it contained something fragile enough to break the world if handled carelessly. The attic had gone completely silent except for the storm raging outside and the distant sounds of movement echoing somewhere deep below the mansion floors. Eveline knelt beside the loose stone beneath the mirror while Mrs. Porter stood frozen near the bed staring at the tarnished silver surface now resting in the Duke's scarred hands. You are certain? Eveline whispered softly. Lucien's thumb brushed carefully across the faded crest engraved into the lid. A raven surrounded by winter roses. I commissioned this for Eleanor 19 years ago. His voice had changed again. Lower now, stripped of some carefully controlled distance. Eveline stared at him in shock. You gave it to her. Yes. Silence followed immediately. The realization settled slowly and heavily through the attic room. Lucien Ashbourne had not merely known Eleanor Marrow. He had loved her. The truth existed quietly beneath every careful sentence he spoke about her. Every year he spent searching after everyone else stopped asking questions. Mrs. Porter seemed to realize it too. Her eyes widened faintly before softening with sudden understanding. Oh, she whispered quietly. Lucien did not respond. He turned the music box slowly beneath the flickering lamplight while snow battered violently against the circular attic window. Eveline watched him carefully. She had never seen him hold anything gently before. Yet now his scarred hands moved with impossible care across worn silver edges damaged by time and secrecy. Mother hated this box, Eveline said softly. Lucien looked up immediately. Why? She said it encouraged childish attachment to dead people. The Duke's expression hardened almost invisibly. Of course she did. Eveline swallowed hard. Mrs. Porter hid it for me when I was little. The older housekeeper nodded slowly. Your aunt left it behind the week she disappeared. Lucien went still again. What? Mrs. Porter looked suddenly nervous beneath his sharp attention. I never spoke about it because Mrs. Marrow ordered the servants to remove every personal belonging Eleanor owned after the funeral. There was no funeral, Lucien said quietly. Exactly. Mrs. Porter clasped trembling hands together tightly. But the household still behaved as though she had already been buried. Silence settled heavily again. Eveline looked between them uncertainly. Why would Aunt Eleanor leave the music box here? Lucien's pale eyes lowered toward the silver lid once more. Because Eleanor never trusted banks. His thumb pressed gently against one side of the box. A soft metallic click echoed suddenly through the attic room. Eveline startled. Mrs. Porter gasped softly. A hidden compartment had opened beneath the false bottom of the music box. Lucien stared downward silently for one long second before reaching carefully inside. He withdrew a folded yellowed paper no larger than a calling card. Evelyn's pulse thundered instantly beneath her ribs. What is that? Lucian unfolded the paper slowly. His expression changed the moment he read the first line. Not shock. Worse than shock. Recognition. Your Grace, Mrs. Porter whispered nervously. Lucian looked toward Eveline then. Something dark and terrible moved quietly beneath his composure now. Your aunt knew she was being watched. The attic seemed to freeze around those words. Eveline rose slowly to her feet. What does it say? Lucian hesitated briefly before reading aloud. If anything happens to me, the ledgers are beneath the West Library floor. Vivian already knows. Silence crashed through the room. Eveline felt the blood drain slowly from her face. Mrs. Porter pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. Dear God. Lucian continued reading quietly. Do not trust the Blackthorn accounts. They paid someone inside the household. His jaw tightened visibly now. And if I disappear before winter ends, tell Adrian he was right about the corridor shipments. Eveline frowned faintly. Adrian. Lucian folded the note carefully once more. Your father. The storm outside seemed louder suddenly. Violent wind shaking ancient beams overhead, while somewhere far below another crash echoed through the dark mansion corridors. Lucian slid the note into his inner coat pocket immediately. We leave now. Eveline blinked rapidly. What about the West Library? If Blackthorn men entered the estate tonight, they are searching for the same ledgers. His expression hardened further. Which means the documents still exist. Mrs. Porter moved quickly toward the wardrobe, retrieving the packed travel case from beside the bed. Then they cannot reach the library first. No, Lucian looked toward the stairwell sharply. They cannot. Another distant shout echoed downstairs, followed by hurried footsteps racing through lower hallways. Eveline felt panic surge instantly again. Your men. Hopefully. Lucian crossed toward the attic doorway and listened briefly before turning back toward Eveline. Can you walk? The question startled her slightly. Yes. Good. He picked up the small travel case himself before gesturing toward the books still clutched tightly against her chest. Keep those with you. Eveline nodded faintly. Everything suddenly felt unreal again. Hidden notes. Secret ledgers. Armed men searching the estate while snow buried the grounds outside. Her entire life had transformed into something unrecognizable within a single evening. Lucian seemed to notice her panic immediately. Stay close to me, he said quietly. Do not stop moving unless I tell you. The calmness in his voice steadied her more than reassurance would have. He spoke like a man accustomed to dangerous nights. Mrs. Porter wrapped a thick wool shawl tightly around Eveline's shoulders before squeezing her hand once. You must leave this house now, child. Eveline looked toward the older woman suddenly stricken. What about you? Mrs. Porter managed a faint sad smile. I have survived your mother for 16 years. Lucian interrupted softly. You leave with us. The housekeeper blinked in surprise. Your Grace, Blackthorn men entered this estate tonight, Lucian said calmly. Anyone helping Miss Marrow is no longer safe here. Mrs. Porter's composure cracked briefly at those words. Fear flashed openly across her face for the first time all evening. Then she nodded once. Very well. Another loud crash thundered somewhere below, followed by a sharp male voice shouting indistinctly through the corridors. Lucian moved instantly toward the staircase. Now! They descended quickly through the narrow attic stairwell, while wind howled through unseen cracks in the old mansion walls. Eveline followed directly behind Lucian, clutching the books tightly against her chest while Mrs. Porter hurried close behind. Shadows flickered wildly across the corridor walls from distant oil lamps, disturbed by rushing servants and moving soldiers somewhere deeper inside the estate. The mansion no longer felt like home. Not even prison. Felt haunted. They reached the upper hall just as two armed men in dark winter coats appeared at the far staircase landing. Lucian stopped immediately. Eveline nearly collided into his back before catching herself. The strangers froze too. One tall and broad-shouldered. The other lean with silver buttons glinting beneath corridor candlelight. Neither wore Marrow servant uniforms. Blackthorn. Lucian stepped slightly in front of Eveline without looking back at her. Behind me, he said quietly. Panic flooded through her chest. The taller stranger smiled faintly upon recognizing the Duke. Ashbourne. Lucian's expression turned to stone. You entered private property armed during a storm. So did you. The man's gaze shifted briefly toward Eveline. Interesting company tonight. Lucian moved one slow step forward. Leave. The stranger laughed softly. We are searching for estate records on behalf of Mrs. Marrow. Eveline felt sick instantly. Mother sent them. Lucian's pale eyes sharpened dangerously. You mean evidence. Call it what you like. The second man finally spoke. Colder voice. More dangerous somehow. We only require access to the west wing. Silence stretched tightly through the corridor. Snow hammered the tall windows beside the staircase hard enough to blur the world beyond into white chaos. Lucian's hand rested calmly near the revolver hidden beneath his coat. No, he said quietly. The taller stranger smiled again. You always were difficult. Lucian's expression did not change. And you always worked for cowards. The hallway went still. Eveline realized then these men feared him. Not politely, not socially, truly. Even standing armed inside the estate, they measured every movement around Lucian Ashbourne carefully. The second man looked toward Eveline again. Miss Marrow, he said smoothly. Your mother requested we escort you safely to Briar Glen. Eveline felt immediate revulsion twist through her stomach. Lucian answered before she could speak. She stays with me. The taller stranger sighed softly. That complicates things. Lucian stepped forward once more. Good. Silence. Then suddenly footsteps thundered upward from the lower staircase behind the strangers. 3 of Lucian's men appeared moments later carrying lanterns and weapons beneath dark winter coats. The corridor shifted instantly. The Blackthorn men recognized the disadvantage immediately. The taller one smiled humorlessly toward Lucian. This is not over. No, Lucian agreed quietly. It is not. The 2 strangers retreated slowly backward down the west staircase without turning their backs fully until disappearing into the storm-dark lower halls below. Eveline realized only then that her hands were shaking violently around the books. Lucian looked toward one of his men. Secure the west wing immediately. Yes, Your Grace. 2 soldiers disappeared down the corridor at once. Lucian turned back toward Eveline. We leave now. But before anyone could move, a distant sound drifted suddenly through the mansion from somewhere deep inside the west wing. Music. Faint. Fragile. A delicate melody carried through the storm-dark corridors like a ghost waking beneath the house. Eveline froze instantly. So did Lucian. The music box melody. The same song hidden inside the silver box now tucked beneath Lucian's coat. Mrs. Porter went pale beside them. That is impossible. Lucian's entire expression hardened with terrible recognition. No, he said softly. It means someone already found the library. The melody drifted through the mansion corridors faint and broken beneath the storm outside. Delicate piano notes. Slow. Mechanical. The exact tune hidden inside Eleanor Marrow's silver music box. Eveline felt every hair along her arms rise instantly beneath the wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Nobody moved for one terrible second. Then Lucian Ashbourne turned sharply toward the west corridor. His entire expression had become frighteningly still. Stay behind me, he said quietly. The command snapped everyone back into motion. Lucian's men moved immediately down the hallway with lanterns raised high against the darkness swallowing the west wing staircase beyond. Eveline followed close behind Lucian, clutching the books tightly against her chest while Mrs. Porter hurried beside her, trembling visibly now. The music continued somewhere deeper inside the mansion. Soft, fragile, haunting, like a memory refusing burial. The west corridor looked different from the rest of Marrow Estate. Darker somehow. Dust clung heavily across the wallpaper and old portraits lining the walls remained hidden beneath white sheets that shifted faintly whenever cold drafts slipped through unseen cracks in the ancient stone. Eveline had never been allowed near this wing before. Even as a child, servants redirected her elsewhere whenever she wandered too close. Now she understood why. Secrets lived here. Lucian reached the boarded library entrance first. Thick wooden planks crossed the double doors from floor to ceiling exactly as Eveline remembered. Except now several boards had been ripped away violently and splintered would littered the carpet beneath them. One lantern flickered weakly inside the darkness beyond. Someone already entered. The music stopped abruptly. Silence crashed through the corridor. Lucien drew the revolver from beneath his coat again without hesitation. "Positions," he ordered softly. His men spread instantly through the hallway while snowlight flashed pale through tall windows at the corridor's far end. Eveline's pulse hammered violently inside her throat. Mrs. Porter grabbed her hand tightly. "Stay close." Lucien approached the broken library doorway slowly. Controlled. Every movement precise. He pushed one damaged door inward carefully with his free hand. The hinges groaned softly through the silence. Cold air rushed out, immediately carrying dust and old paper and something else beneath it. Rotting smoke. Eveline frowned faintly. "There was no fire," she whispered. Lucien's pale eyes scanned the darkness inside. "No," his voice lowered further. "But someone wanted people to believe there had been." Lantern light revealed the West Library slowly piece by piece. Vast shelves climbed nearly 20 feet toward a shadowed painted ceiling hidden beneath thick dust and hanging cobwebs. Torn sheets covered abandoned furniture. Broken glass glittered faintly across the carpet near tall, frost-covered windows overlooking the snowstorm outside. The room looked frozen in time, like something deliberately abandoned before finishing its final sentence. And near the center of the library stood a man neither Eveline nor Mrs. Porter recognized. He wore a dark wool coat dusted with snow and held another lantern loosely at his side while staring directly toward them. Older perhaps. Gray beginning at the temples. Sharp eyes. Calm posture. Not frightened at all despite the armed men surrounding him. Lucien stopped instantly upon seeing him. "Blackthorn." The stranger smiled faintly. "Ashbourne." Eveline felt the tension inside the library tighten dangerously. Lucien's voice turned colder than winter itself. "You entered private property armed during an active investigation." "So did you." The man glanced briefly toward Eveline. Interesting that the girl finally made it inside. Lucien stepped slightly in front of her before she could react. "What are you doing here?" The stranger looked around the abandoned library slowly. "Searching for old mistakes." Lucien's revolver remained perfectly steady in his hand. "You mean evidence." "Same thing tonight." Silence stretched heavily between them while wind screamed outside the cracked windows hard enough to rattle ancient glass inside its frames. Eveline noticed something strange then. The stranger did not appear nervous facing Lucien Ashbourne. Cautious perhaps, but not frightened, which meant he either underestimated Lucien or understood him far too well already. "Where is Vivian?" Lucien asked quietly. The man smiled without warmth. "Still asking questions after all these years. Answer." "No." The stranger's gaze drifted slowly toward the hidden silver music box now tucked beneath Lucien's coat. "I think perhaps you should answer mine first." Lucien went completely still. The stranger noticed immediately. "Ah," he murmured softly. "So the box survived after all." Eveline felt cold move sharply through her stomach. "You know about the music box?" The man looked directly at her for the first time. "Of course I do, Miss Marrow." His smile thinned slightly. "Your aunt nearly destroyed 3 powerful families over what she hid inside it." Silence crashed through the library. Lucien's expression hardened dangerously. "Careful." "Or what?" The stranger tilted his head faintly. "You shoot me before learning why Vivian Marrow ran tonight?" Eveline's pulse stumbled. Lucien did not lower the weapon. "Speak carefully." The stranger sighed softly. Eleanor Marrow believed she uncovered illegal corridor shipments moving through northern trade routes 17 years ago. Mrs. Porter inhaled sharply behind Eveline. "Smuggling," she whispered. "No," the stranger corrected calmly. "Something worse." Lucien's jaw tightened visibly. "Enough." But the stranger ignored him now. "The northern corridors funded military contracts after the border wars ended," he continued. "Unofficial contracts. Weapons moved quietly through private estates using falsified shipping ledgers. Eveline stared at him in disbelief. My father was involved? Your father discovered it too late. The stranger's expression darkened slightly. Eleanor intended exposure. Adrian Marrow intended negotiation. Lucian's voice cut sharply across the room. And Blackthorn intended profit. Silence. The stranger smiled faintly. Everyone intended survival. Eveline looked toward Lucian uncertainly. You knew about this. Lucian remained perfectly still. Not all of it, but enough. The stranger crossed slowly toward one section of the library shelves while keeping both hands visible. Your Duke spent 17 years chasing ghosts through frozen trade routes and burned accounting houses because he refused accepting Eleanor's death. Lucian's eyes sharpened dangerously. Do not say her name. The quiet fury in his voice made the entire room tense instantly. Eveline had never heard him sound like that before. The stranger noticed too. Still grieving, he observed softly. How tragic. Lucian stepped forward one slow pace. Last warning. The stranger stopped beside one particular bookshelf and brushed dust lightly from the wood with gloved fingers. Vivian Marrow did not kill Eleanor alone. Silence exploded through the library. Eveline stopped breathing entirely. What? She whispered. The stranger looked toward her with unsettling calm. Your mother lacked courage for murder by herself. Lucian's expression turned to stone. Who helped her? The man smiled faintly again. That depends which death you mean. Mrs. Porter gasped softly behind Eveline. Lucian's entire body seemed to harden at once. You are running out of time. No, the stranger tapped lightly against one section of bookshelf paneling. Hollow wood echoed softly through the silent library. You are. Eveline stared toward the shelves in shock. Hidden space. Hidden documents. Lucian realized it instantly too. He moved sharply toward the bookshelf just as the stranger suddenly stepped backward into darkness beyond the lantern light. One of Lucian's men lunged immediately after him. A crash echoed violently through the library. Shelves shook. Glass shattered somewhere near the windows. Then footsteps thundered through a hidden passage concealed behind the moving bookshelf panel. Stop him, Lucian ordered sharply. Two soldiers disappeared instantly into the dark passage after the fleeing stranger. Eveline's pulse thundered painfully inside her ears. The hidden doorway remained open now, revealing narrow stone stairs descending beneath the mansion itself. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the smell of damp earth and ancient paper. Lucian ignored the passage for the moment and turned immediately toward the exposed compartment hidden behind the bookshelf. Inside sat 3 old ledger books wrapped carefully in oilcloth beside a locked iron document box blackened faintly along one edge. Eveline stared at them in disbelief. They were here all this time. Lucian lowered the revolver slowly without taking his eyes from the hidden compartment. Yes. Mrs. Porter stepped closer, trembling visibly. Dear God. Lucian handed the weapon briefly to one of his remaining men before removing the oilcloth from the ledgers with careful hands. Dust swirled through the lantern light as faded writing emerged across cracked leather bindings. Northern trade routes. Private corridor accounts. Winter shipment records. Eveline felt sick suddenly. 17 years of secrets hidden beneath her own home. Lucian opened the first ledger carefully. His eyes moved rapidly across the pages before his entire expression darkened. What is it? Eveline whispered. Lucian did not answer immediately. Then finally he looked toward her. Your father documented everything before he died. Silence. Heavy and terrible. Lucian turned several more pages slowly beneath the lantern glow. Illegal shipments. Blackthorn payments. Altered inheritance transfers. His scarred hand stopped abruptly near the ledger center. Eveline watched all remaining color disappear from his face. Lucian. He stared silently at the page for one long second before speaking. There is another signature here. Eveline moved closer instinctively. Whose? Lucian lifted his pale eyes toward her slowly. And for the first time since arriving at Marrow Estate, Eveline saw genuine shock break through his perfect control. Mine. The library went completely silent after Lucien spoke that single word. Mine. Snow hammered violently against the west wing windows while lantern light flickered across ancient shelves and hidden ledgers scattered beside the exposed compartment beneath the bookshelf. Eveline stared at him in disbelief. Mrs. Porter looked equally stunned. Even Lucien's remaining men had frozen where they stood. Lucien Ashbourne did not move for several long seconds. His pale eyes remained fixed upon the signature inked across the yellowed ledger page beneath his scarred hand. Eveline stepped closer slowly. "That is impossible," she whispered. Lucien finally inhaled once through his nose before answering. "Yes." But his voice no longer sounded certain. Eveline looked down toward the page. The signature resembled his exactly. Sharp lettering. Deliberate strokes. Lucien Ashbourne written beside shipment authorizations dated 17 years earlier. The same winter Eleanor vanished. "You said you were searching for the truth," Eveline whispered faintly. Lucien closed the ledger abruptly. "I was." Something dark moved beneath his composure now. Not fear. Worse, doubt. Eveline watched it spread quietly through the silence between them. "Your Grace," Mrs. Porter said carefully. "Could the signature be forged?" Lucien remained motionless. Possibly, but he did not sound convinced. One of his men approached from the hidden staircase passage, then stopped upon sensing the tension filling the library. "Sir." Lucien lifted one hand slightly without looking away from the ledgers. "Report." The tunnel exits near the frozen carriage road east of the estate. The soldier glanced uneasily toward the open ledger books. The Blackthorn man escaped into the storm. Lucien nodded once. "Secure the grounds anyway." "Yes, Your Grace." The soldier disappeared again without further question. Silence returned immediately. Eveline studied Lucien carefully now. Every controlled breath. Every fraction of tension hidden beneath stillness. For the first time since arriving at Marrow Estate, he looked uncertain of himself. The realization unsettled her deeply. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. Lucien looked toward her slowly. "I do not remember signing these records." "But you think you might have." He said nothing, which answered enough. Eveline felt cold move steadily through her chest. "What happened 17 years ago?" Lucien crossed slowly toward the frost-covered windows, carrying the closed ledger beneath one arm. Snowlight turned his expression pale and distant. After the border conflicts ended, northern estates became transport routes for military inventory. His voice sounded quieter now. Older somehow. Weapons. Supply crates. Unregistered shipments. Eveline listened carefully. "Your father discovered certain corridor accounts were being falsified. And you?" Lucien stared out into the storm beyond the glass. "I was 24. Angry. Recently returned from war." His scarred hand tightened faintly against the ledger spine. Blackthorn financiers approached Northmoor offering investment partnerships tied to military reconstruction. Mrs. Porter frowned. "You accepted." Briefly. Silence stretched painfully. Lucien finally turned back toward them. "At the time I believed the shipments were legal." Eveline searched his face desperately for deception and found none. Only exhaustion. "Then Eleanor found the truth," she whispered. Lucien's jaw tightened. "Yes." The room quieted further around them. Eveline understood suddenly why Lucien never stopped searching after Eleanor vanished. Not only grief. Guilt. The possibility that his own signature existed somewhere inside the machinery that destroyed her. "Did my father know about your involvement?" she asked softly. Lucien looked down briefly. "Adrian confronted me 3 weeks before his death." "What did he say?" A long silence followed. Then finally Lucien answered quietly. "He asked whether I truly believed good men stayed good by pretending ignorance." The words settled heavily through the library. Eveline looked toward the hidden ledgers spread across the floor beside the secret compartment. Her father documented everything before dying. Not merely to expose Vivian or Blackthorn. To leave truth behind for someone willing to face it eventually. "You did not know Eleanor would disappear," she said softly. Lucien looked at her sharply then. Something vulnerable flickered briefly beneath his perfect control. No, the answer came immediately. Honestly, Eveline believed him. Strange how easily she believed him now compared to everyone else in her life. Because Lucien never softened ugly truths. Never reshaped them into comfort. Mrs. Porter crossed slowly toward the hidden compartment beneath the bookshelf. There are more documents here. Lucien regained control instantly. The vulnerability vanished behind cold focus once more. He knelt beside the compartment and began sorting through additional papers hidden beneath the ledgers. Contracts, financial transfers, handwritten notes. Then suddenly his movements stopped. Eveline stepped closer. What is it? Lucien withdrew one folded document carefully from beneath the others. Different paper, different handwriting, familiar handwriting. Eveline recognized it immediately. Her mother's. Lucien unfolded the page silently while snow roared against the windows hard enough to shake the ancient glass. His eyes moved rapidly across the contents once before going completely still. What does it say? Eveline whispered. Lucien looked toward her slowly. It is a confession. The room stopped breathing again. Mrs. Porter pressed trembling fingers against the nearest bookshelf for support. Eveline felt her pulse hammer violently beneath her throat. No, Lucien handed her the paper carefully. Read it yourself. Eveline took the document with shaking hands. Her mother's elegant handwriting filled the page in sharp, deliberate lines. If Eleanor proceeds with exposure, everything collapses. Blackthorn already suspects Adrian intends cooperation with Ashbourne. They will not allow it. I warned Eleanor repeatedly to remain silent. She refused. The rest blurred briefly through Eveline's gathering tears before sharpening again. Adrian is too weak to intervene now. Once the girl reaches inheritance age, remaining transfers become impossible. Isolation must continue until legal authority shifts permanently. Eveline stopped breathing. The letter trembled violently in her hands. Not because she doubted its truth anymore. Because her mother wrote about her like property, like strategy, like burden. Lucien watched her silently while she finished the final lines. Blackthorn will arrange transport once the institution confirms acceptance. Afterward, nobody will question the matter further. The library seemed to tilt around Eveline. Mrs. Porter covered her mouth with one shaking hand. Monster, she whispered softly. Eveline lowered the letter slowly. Tears slid silently down her face now, but she no longer tried hiding them. She planned everything, she whispered. Lucien's expression remained carved from stone. Yes. Silence crashed through the west wing while the storm screamed outside, and somewhere deep beneath the mansion hidden tunnels carried 17 years of buried corruption beneath frozen earth. Eveline looked toward Lucien uncertainly. What happens now? He held her gaze steadily. Now the truth becomes public. Panic flickered instantly beneath her ribs. Mother will destroy herself before allowing that. Perhaps. Lucien crossed slowly toward her then. Close enough now that she could see exhaustion hidden beneath his pale eyes. But she can no longer destroy you with it. The words struck harder than anything else that night. Eveline stared at him while snowlight flickered pale across his scarred hands, and the hidden music box melody still echoed faintly somewhere inside her memory. No longer destroy you. Not protect. Not save. Destroy. Because he understood finally what Vivian truly had been all along. Mrs. Porter moved quietly toward the library entrance. The storm is worsening. Lucien nodded once without looking away from Eveline. We leave immediately. Eveline glanced down toward the confession letter still trembling in her hands. And the estate? Will be sealed until formal investigation begins. Lucien gently took the paper from her before gathering the remaining ledgers and documents into a leather satchel one of his men carried forward silently. Years of lies packed away piece by piece beneath lantern light. Eveline looked around the abandoned library one final time. The hidden compartment. The dust-covered shelves. The broken doorway revealing the corridor beyond where she had never been permitted to walk before tonight. Her entire life hidden behind walls built from other people's fear. Lucien seemed to sense her thoughts. You owe this house nothing, he said quietly. Eveline swallowed hard. It is still my home. No, his voice softened slightly. It is where they kept you. Silence. Then slowly something inside Eveline loosened for the first time in years. Not fear entirely. That would take longer. But shame perhaps. The terrible belief that confinement had somehow been deserved. She looked toward Lucien carefully. And now? Lucien regarded her steadily beneath the flickering lantern light. Now you decide what comes next. The simplicity of the answer nearly broke her again. Choice. Real choice. Not manipulation disguised as concern. Not obedience mistaken for safety. Actual freedom standing uncertainly before her like a door finally unlocked. Outside, dawn had begun faintly beneath the storm clouds. Pale gray light touched the frost-covered windows while snow continued falling across the frozen estate grounds. Eveline realized suddenly that morning was coming. The longest night of her life was ending. Lucien stepped beside her quietly. There is something else you should know. Eveline looked toward him. He hesitated only briefly this time. Your aunt's final letter never reached me completely. What do you mean? Lucien reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew another weathered paper folded carefully with age. Only half survived the fire at Northmoor Archives years ago. Eveline frowned faintly. Fire. Lucien's expression darkened. One of many convenient accidents. He unfolded the fragile page carefully before handing it to her. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. Delicate, elegant. The final lines remained partially burned away at the edges but still readable beneath the lantern glow. If anything happens to me, promise me one thing. Do not let the little girl grow up believing fear is love. Eveline stared at the words while tears blurred her vision completely at last. Lucien watched her silently for one long moment before speaking softly into the quiet dawn gathering beyond the storm. I intend to keep that promise.